almost the size of the United States, how do you find? In a search area almost the size of the United States, how do you find a 300-ton jet?
Well, I don't think people realize just how big the world actually is. There's still parts of the ocean that remain uncharted.
What does it mean for the future?
There's going to have to be some kind of safety reporting system that can't be switched off by the crew.
This is the story of the missing Malaysian plane, told by the world's top aviation experts.
The disappearance of Flight 370, not a game changer, it's a world changer.
March 8th, 2014. A Malaysian Airlines plane flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing disappears from radar an hour into its flight, sparking one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. In the days that follow, multiple theories emerge about what happened when flight MH370 disappeared. Terrorism, pilot suicide, mechanical failure, and cyber hijacking. It's a mystery that has gripped the world.
It's perhaps because down deep people still see an airplane flying overhead and don't understand completely that there's physics involved, it's flying, it's fine. There's some miracle about it. So when something goes wrong with that miracle, it's frightening.
So what do we know? The plane took off from Kuala Lumpur at 12:40 a.m. local time on Saturday, March 8th. It was due to arrive in Beijing just over 6 hours later at 6:30 a.m. At 7 minutes past 1, the last signal from the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS, which relays technical health checks to the ground, is received. At 1:19, the plane leaves Malaysian airspace. The crew gives their final sign-off. They should now check in with Vietnamese air traffic control, but fail to do so. On the face of it, the crew, seen here as they pass through security at Kuala Lumpur, are a good team. First Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran pilot with 18,000 flying hours, has a reputation as a conscientious and professional flyer. Next, the co-pilot, Farik Abdul Hamid. He was on the verge of proposing to his girlfriend, who is also a pilot. The plane they're flying, a Boeing 777, has an excellent track record. It's a favorite among pilots. This Boeing is the world's largest twin-engine passenger jet. It entered commercial service in 1995.
The Boeing 777 is one of the safest aircraft ever to fly. It's the first airliner ever built strictly on a computer. Although it's only twin engine, it's a very large airplane and has very quickly become a very popular airliner with airlines all around the world. They've sold over 1,100 so far and going strong.
At 21 minutes past 1, the cockpit device that sends and receives radar signals, called the transponder, is turned off. Less than 10 minutes later, at 1:30 in the morning, the plane disappears from air traffic control radar. At 2:15 in the morning comes the last sighting on military radar. We now know that after losing contact, Malaysian military radar observes the plane taking a sharp left turn to the west, a maneuver confirmed by the Thai military.
That would seem highly unlikely that an aircraft would be changing its direction as it did without some intervention from somebody. But, you know, someone turned off the equipment, someone reprogrammed the computers to fly in a different direction. Airplanes don't do that themselves.
This is a crucial moment in working out the fate of the missing plane. Was the crew reacting to an emergency and trying to reach the nearest airport? What was happening on board? Only a week later would it emerge that satellite signals were still being picked up 7 hours after the plane went missing. They were picked up by a British satellite firm called Inmarsat. The last of those signals was at 11 minutes past 8 in the morning.
The airplane was sending information back and forth to the Inmarsat 3F1 satellite over the Indian Ocean. And while it wasn't sending proper messages, it was just sort of sending "I'm alive" pings. One of the things it picked out was the speed of the plane relative to the satellite. And so we know from that information that the plane was traveling at hundreds of miles an hour. It wasn't crashed on the bottom of the ocean or something like that.
In the days that follow, each new clue only seems to deepen the mystery. At its peak, the search will cover a staggering 2.96 million square miles, involve 7 nations, and aviation experts from around the world. Back on March 8, when relatives and friends gather in Beijing to meet flight MH370, they are told the plane has been delayed. Quickly, it becomes apparent this is much more serious. People are taken to a city hotel, but they still don't know what's going on.
Nobody has told us anything. Nobody talks to us except volunteers and hotel staff.
Officials have no idea where the plane is.
We do not have any findings at this point in time. The search and rescue team has started since morning. Everyone has put in an effort. Yet we have not found any wreckage. No wreckage whatsoever.
As Malaysia wakes up, people gather in Kuala Lumpur airport, desperate to learn the fate of friends and family. But nothing is forthcoming. The search starts immediately. The U.S. 7th Fleet joins in, aware time is running out.
As every hour goes by, the search area gets bigger and bigger. A person can survive in the water for at least 72 hours due to sheer willpower. After that, the chances of survival get less and less, and that's what we're concerned with right now.
But what about the plane? If MH370 had ditched in the sea, how long could it stay afloat?
Oh my God, it was a big plane. I heard a big boom just now.
When an Airbus A320 hit a flock of geese and ditched in the Hudson River near Midtown Manhattan in January 2009, it floated for long enough to be secured by boats. All the passengers were rescued.
3 or 4 minutes into the flight, I was sitting in 22A, so the left engine just blew. Fire, flames coming out of it. Looked over the water and we thought we had a chance because, you know, there was some water, and got to give it to the pilot, man. He made a hell of a landing.
But that was on a fairly placid river, not an ocean. Even if the Malaysia jet had ditched as successfully as the Miracle on the Hudson, there was no land nearby. It would be at the mercy of a sea where wind speeds reach 40 miles an hour and the waves can be almost 20 feet high. And if it did reach the surface in one piece, it would take only minutes before it started sinking the 2.5 miles down to the seabed. On day 2, as the search is starting to gather momentum, comes the announcement there is very little hope left of finding people alive.
We have communicated to the family members that after more than 30 hours without any contact with the aircraft, we believe that the family members should prepare themselves for the worst.
Relatives and friends are beside themselves with grief and anger. Without knowing what has happened to their loved ones, the sense of loss intensifies. What follows is one of the biggest and most intense search operations ever mounted for a missing aircraft. The area it covers is vast, millions of square miles. Ships, planes, and submarines from 7 countries scour the sea, to find debris and clues. But it soon becomes apparent. This is a mystery unlike any in the annals of aviation. It's day 3 in the hunt for Malaysia Flight 370. Searchers are desperate to find the black boxes, which are critical to finding out what happened. There are actually 2 black boxes, one located at the rear of the plane containing all the technical flight data, and one at the front of the plane recording conversations in the cockpit. Both are essential to knowing the plane's fate. The satellite firm Inmarsat looks again at the signals, or pings, to get a more accurate idea of where the search operation should be looking.
The engineers at Inmarsat have managed to do an incredible analysis that picks out partial information about what the plane was doing. And this is what scientists love. You have partial clues, and it's like a crossword where you've just got a couple of words missing, and you try and make guesses to fill it in, and you can constrain where the plane might have been, but you can't get a specific position.
With no wreckage and no black boxes, the investigation looks elsewhere for clues to what happened. When Malaysia Air Flight 370 disappeared, it vanished suddenly from radar screens, and there was no distress call from the pilot.
It is extremely uncommon for aircraft to disappear.
How often do planes seem to disappear? Almost never.
I think no one can rule out foul play at this stage, and that could be anything from a terrorist attack across to an act of sabotage.
In December 1988, another flight, Pan Am 103, mysteriously disappeared from radar with no distress call. Its wreckage devastated the tiny town of Lockerbie, Scotland. 270 people lost their lives. The evidence pointed to a bomb concealed in a suitcase in the hold, checked in by a passenger who never boarded. The tragedy led to much tighter security across the industry.
After Lockerbie, we saw hold baggage having to be 100% screened, and anything that wasn't reconciled with the passenger would be removed from the aircraft.
The years since Pan Am 103 have seen a deadly race between terrorist bomb innovation and systems developed to counter them. Each new threat has brought new security measures. In 2001, British terrorist Richard Reed unsuccessfully attempted to detonate explosives in his shoes during a flight between Paris and Miami. In 2006, British police uncovered a terrorist plot to detonate liquid explosives in 10 airliners traveling from the United Kingdom to the US and Canada. And in 2010, powder explosives were found hidden in printer cartridges on a UPS cargo plane at East Midlands Airport in England.
After the Richard Reed incident, a new methodology, we all had to start taking our shoes off. The liquid bomb plot, and we all know the absolute chaos that caused with taking liquids on board an aircraft. So new protective measures have to be put into place.
Could it be that a new generation of terrorist bomb took out flight MH370?
We still could find that there has been an explosive device that has been used by a terror group to get control of the plane. We've seen powder explosives on the printer bomb. We've got mobile phones on planes that can potentially put in bombs, and we've got small amounts of liquid. So we could have a bomb maker in Malaysia that is supporting an international terror group.
But there is evidence to suggest that MH370 could not have exploded like the Lockerbie plane.
Lockerbie disappeared off the air traffic control secondary radar, but the bits falling out of the sky, bits of aluminium fluttering down, could still be seen on primary radar. In the case of MH370, the Malaysian military saw the aircraft, but it didn't disappear for them. They kept on seeing it. They watched it go somewhere. They didn't watch anything fluttering to the ground.
The failure of the air and sea search to find any wreckage around MH370's last known location suggested a bomb had not brought down the plane. But if a sudden devastating explosion was not responsible, what was? The investigation now focused on air traffic control's secondary radar and a radio device located in the cockpit of the 777 called the transponder.
A transponder is a way for air traffic control to more accurately track aircraft under its control. A transponder is actually a box in the aircraft, and it responds to a radar. When the radar energy sweeps across the aircraft, the transponder will receive that energy and then respond back with a signal. Air traffic control uses this information to accurately identify your radar blip on their screen and to know what altitude you're at.
When MH370's transponder stopped transmitting at 1:21 a.m. on Sunday, March 8th, the plane disappeared from air control radar screens. Did the part fail, or was it physically switched off?
It would be highly unlikely that the transponder would turn itself off. As pilots, we're always trained that the transponder should be on, especially when we're taking off, and not to forget it. So it would take a physical action to turn the switch to off.
If the transponder was switched off, who was responsible and why? Could it be a hijacking?
If we find that MH370 was indeed hijacked through traditional methods, then that's something that the Malaysians will have to look at internally, and within the region and across the globe we're going to have to look at, is what we're doing right now good enough to prevent a hijacker boarding an aircraft?
Early in the investigation, it was announced that 2 passengers had boarded the plane under assumed identities.
We have the CCTV's recording of those passengers from check-in right to the departure point.
Paria Nur Muhammad Murad and Syed Muhammad Raza Delavar were photographed boarding the flight using stolen passports. The stolen passports had been recorded on Interpol's Stolen and Lost Travel Documents database, but both airport and airline staff had failed to make the necessary checks. An international police operation soon tracked down the genuine passport holders. The 2 suspects turned out to be Iranian, raising questions of whether there might be a link to terrorism in the Middle East.
Based on the evidence, the airplane didn't crash where it lost its signals. All of the evidence leads to a conclusion that there was human intervention. The electronic equipment was turned off. That equipment does not fail, not that way. A human had to intervene.
But then, a surprise announcement. The Malaysian police declared that one of the suspects was an asylum seeker.
We believe that he is not likely to be a member of any terrorist group. And we believe that he is trying to migrate to Germany.
Since visa requirements were eased for Iranian nationals traveling to Malaysia, the country has become a hub for Iranians looking for ways to emigrate to Europe. But if it was a hijacking, how could an intruder have gained access to the cockpit? Since 9/11, flight deck doors have been reinforced, now bullet and axe-proof, to prevent intruders, giving pilots time to make a distress call. In the absence of any tangible evidence to explain the plane's disappearance, new theories emerge, including cyber terrorism.
The cyber attack would be a highly sophisticated attack, which at the moment would seem the most unlikely, but that's only because we haven't seen it before. The day before 9/11, we never would have imagined that an aircraft would have been used effectively as a cruise missile to attack New York and Washington.
In 2011, the Iranian government released these pictures of a downed U.S. military drone. They claimed that it had been brought down by their cyber warfare unit.
The drone's controls were taken over. The drone thought it was going back to its home landing. High deception using satellites and commands through to the computers. A cyber hijack really is a new form of warfare, and it's taking us into cyberspace where actually all forms of warfare are now concentrating on.
But is it possible that something as large and sophisticated as a Boeing 777 could be remotely hijacked?
I've seen evidence from an aircraft manufacturer not too long ago that would indicate it is possible, and I believe that it's something that the agencies within the region and Boeing must be looking at very seriously.
A cyber hijack is an act of taking over control. People within the passenger cabin may be able to enter into these systems by hacking through the entertainment systems, or there may have been airside access through the maintenance windows. And a pre-programmed plot timed to actually simulate the pilot's activities has taken that plane off course and actually controlled every action of that plane, and potentially may have lost the plane or could have landed the plane.
I honestly don't think a computer hacker could have taken control of the aircraft. Perhaps it's possible. I really doubt that. The systems on board these aircraft are so sophisticated, and they're designed to be as safe as humanly possible. To have a door open in their computers for that, I would find highly unlikely.
5 days after its disappearance, the White House makes a startling announcement. A satellite has picked up information from the plane in the form of an electronic pulse, or ping, which indicates that the flight may have continued for up to 4 hours after it disappeared from air traffic control's radar.
They know it came from the aeroplane, but it wasn't like a transponder response which gave a whole load of identification. They just happened to know that it was that aircraft, but there was no information in this ping. It was just a ping.
The Malaysian government also confirms that their primary radar records show the plane did deviate from its flight path. But each new piece of evidence raises a new question. If the plane changed direction, where was it heading? And if it continued to fly, why did it maintain radio silence? By day 9 of the investigation of Malaysian flight MH370, there are still more questions than answers. Malaysian officials have confirmed a left turn shortly after the final radio transmission from the cockpit. Sudden turns from passenger jets in flight are extremely rare and show that the pilots had actively switched off the autopilot. But why? Could it have been an attempt to commandeer the plane with malicious intent? Or was the crew of MH370 undertaking a desperate effort to get back to land and save the lives of the passengers on board? Some experts are taking seriously the theory that there could have been a catastrophe on board.
I'm still leaning towards some kind of accident, some kind of engineering problem, some kind of problem with cargo releasing gas or catching fire.
I believe at that stage there was some form of catastrophic failure on the aeroplane, either a decompression or perhaps an electrical fire which incapacitated the flight crew. I think the flight crew probably made a valiant effort to get the aeroplane onto a new course to safety.
Pilots are trained to know where their safest landing strip would be in case of an emergency. For Captain Shah, this would not have been Kuala Lumpur because it would have meant flying over an 8,000-foot high ridge. Instead, he would have been making for another airport at Pulau Langkawi.
My belief is that an experienced pilot like the captain of this aircraft would know instantly that he had smoke in the flight deck, that he would have to get to land as soon as possible. The nearest land to him was to the left, off to the west, and I believe he probably turned on to 270 degrees while he tried to resolve the fire issue, heading back towards land and getting ready for an emergency landing.
A fire on board an aircraft would wipe out the transponder and ACARS system, which send flight location and technical data about the aircraft back to base via satellite.
whatever his attempts were, I believe that he probably lost consciousness before he could carry them out successfully, and the rest of the flight was carried out on autopilot, with the autopilot functioning as it would without any form of monitoring.
So was a fire the real culprit? It's been reported that the plane was carrying over 400 pounds of lithium-ion batteries, which can be flammable, in its hold. The accident theory still leaves open the question of why the pilots didn't send a distress call. And with no physical evidence to go on, it can only be a theory. Since the Boeing 777 entered service, the aircraft fleet has accumulated more than 18 million flight hours and has gained a safety record that is second to none.
Well, the Boeing 777 is one of the safest aircraft ever to fly. It is remarkably safe.
But even on the 777, mechanical failures are not unheard of.
Mayday, mayday. Aircraft accident, aircraft accident. Type is a 777. Nature of problem is crash.
Despite its safety record, one Boeing 777 did crash in 2008. A mechanical fault in the fuel line of British Airways Flight 38 caused ice crystals to form in the fuel system. Both engines lost power and failed on its final approach to London's Heathrow Airport. The aircraft just made it onto the runway. No one died, but it would have been a very different story if the plane had failed earlier when in mid-flight. One of the survivors of that crash was former lecturer Paul Stafford.
The oxygen mask fell from the roof of the aircraft, and we seemed to be skidding for an eternity, bumping and bashing around. I smashed my head in the front of the seat. I buckled my body in half. My chest was hurting. We eventually stopped, and it was completely quiet. I looked to my left, and the undercarriage had come through the wing. And at that point, the captain did say, "Evacuate, evacuate," and that's the first moment I realised how serious it had been.
On day 8 of the MH370 investigation, the British satellite company Inmarsat reveals that the plane did not vanish. Their satellite made contact with the plane while it was in the air, strongly suggesting the plane had flown on for a further 7 hours.
The Inmarsat satellite was still logged on to the plane, and so you still got these pings once an hour, where the Inmarsat satellite was basically saying, "Do you have any more ACARS info for me?" And the plane's going, "Got nothing."
Working from data provided by the ping conversation between plane and satellite, it takes investigators a further 9 days to conclude that MH370 had probably ditched somewhere in the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. There's just one problem. With no confirmed course and 7 more hours of potential flight time, the search area now covers millions of square miles. Finding a plane that vanished over open ocean might seem impossible, but it's happened before. In June 2009, Air France 447, an Airbus A330 carrying 228 people on board, disappeared over the Atlantic. A relatively minor mechanical failure was the catalyst for a fatal event.
The Air France A330 that went down over the Atlantic, they didn't know for a while, but they were able to find within 5 days some parts of the aircraft, so they knew where it went down.
They were actually able to find floating debris from that incident because they had more data from the airplane. They were able to narrow down the location of where that aircraft, the last position of that aircraft, a lot more closely.
Aircraft crash investigator Colleen Keller was a key figure in the search for Flight 447, but the initial search area was much smaller than the one for MH370.
We had a search area that was a 40-mile radius, and the way that we determined that search area, it was a circle, was that we had a last known point reported by the 8-car system on the aircraft. The next report should have come 4 minutes later, and it was never received, indicating that the aircraft went into the water at some point during that 4-minute period.
From this information, investigators were able to draw a 40-mile circle, which equated to 5,000 square miles of open water to search. Even so, their task was made much simpler than finding MH370, which continued to fly south long after the plane's ACARS system had stopped working.
That's thousands of square miles. It's 100 times the search area for the Air France search.
Satellite ping communication has revealed that MH370 probably flew toward the Indian Ocean. Investigators now hope satellite photos can help them find wreckage. That is considerably harder than it sounds, even in a world that seems constantly monitored by satellite.
The problem with looking for pieces of debris in the open ocean is you have an area that's not high contrast. Here's what I mean by that. It's possible to look and see very tiny features in satellite images, but it helps to have very high contrast. In other words, if you have a very reflective object against a very black background, that kind of object will be very visible and will be easy to identify. Well, the open ocean isn't like that. You've got objects that are maybe floating in the ocean, might be just beneath the surface. You've got sun reflecting off the waves. So it's not an environment where it's really easy to pick out small objects that might be floating there.
After many false starts, and with no positive ID on any debris, investigators turned their attention back to the pilots. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah had joined Malaysia Airlines in 1981.
This is a YouTube video that I made as a community service.
An aviation fanatic, he had even built a flight simulator in his home, which mirrored the setup of the Boeing 777 he was piloting. Could this have offered any further clues to Malaysian authorities?
We took possession of a simulator, of a flight simulator, and we have dismantled it from the home, and we have assembled it at our office, and we are getting experts to look at it now.
Have him check and fix the leakage.
They reveal that data on the simulator had been deleted before the captain took control of the flight.
When files are deleted from a simulator, it may mean that the size of the files is so large that one cleans the system as one goes. But the authorities are getting those files unlocked. They will undelete them, and that may take a little time. But forensically, that is going to be very exciting for the investigation, because it may show exactly the types of very innocent assessments that pilot was doing, or it may show an intention, for a psychological reason perhaps, to create this different pathway that this plane has gone.
Even without the data from his simulator, investigators are about to discover startling new information about Captain Shah. Nine days into the hunt for Malaysia Airlines MH370, the mystery of what happened in the cockpit deepens. Previously believed to have been a proud father and grandfather with a secure and happy marriage, it emerges that Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah's wife had left him just hours before he took off from Kuala Lumpur. Experts shift the focus of their investigation to Shah's psychological profile.
Perhaps they have a theory that, he was very, very depressed, and therefore he caused the aircraft to crash. That might be one theory. And so they might be trying to ascertain, was he really depressed at the time, and what would be reasons that would be causing him to want to take his life.
Chris Neeson, a fellow pilot and close friend of Shah's, finds it hard to believe that he would crack under emotional strain.
He was one of the original 777 fleet captains. He's a great guy, just a great pilot. I think it attests to his experiences, 18,000 hours of flying, great career. With his character and what we knew of him, it just wouldn't make any sense that he would have anything to do with any sort of deliberate action on his part.
There are questions, too, about the character and professionalism of 27-year-old co-pilot Farik Abdul Hamid. It's revealed that he had broken flight rules by inviting 2 women into the cockpit during a flight from Phuket to Kuala Lumpur in 2011.
The areas that are going to be looked at is the sort of almost the roguish nature of the first officer that's being portrayed in the press in terms of, you know, his affairs with girls and things like that. But I think that still turned out just to be a young man with normal desires.
Concerns about Hamid's mental state are downgraded when news breaks that he was about to propose to his girlfriend. Still, the question remains, could either pilot have decided to kill themselves, taking the plane and everyone on board with them? Attention turns to 2 recent cases of such suspected pilot suicide. The first happened in 1997, when a Silk Air flight went down in Indonesia, killing 104 people. U.S. investigators said the pilot had probably crashed the jet on purpose. The U.S. findings contradicted an Indonesian investigation that rejected suicide theory. Just 2 years later, in 1999, 217 people died when their Egypt Air flight from New York plunged into the Atlantic Ocean. Again, U.S. investigators concluded pilot suicide by First Officer Gamil al-Batouti. But Egyptian investigators have consistently disputed this. DNA evidence was found that supported the U.S. view.
The physical evidence that was available to the investigators included the fact that there was only one pilot's DNA on the flight deck. The flight deck door was locked at the time of the accident. The other pilot's DNA was on the far side of the cockpit door, as was the fire axe.
Did this scenario play out on the flight deck of MH370? Could the pilot or co-pilot have locked the other out of the cockpit and taken over the plane with malign intent, leaving their colleagues struggling to break down the reinforced security door? We may never know. But on April 2nd, Malaysian police announced that they have ruled all passengers out of their investigation, narrowing their inquiry to cabin and cockpit crew only. As the search for psychological clues to the mindsets of the pilot and co-pilot continue in Malaysia, the hunt for wreckage goes on in the Indian Ocean, using a system that was employed to find Air France 447 in 2011.
Air France 447 went down in the middle of the Atlantic. We performed a technique called probability mapping, and it's a way to assemble uncertain information, often conflicting information, into a single probability map. Hot, indicating high probability that the target is there, and cold, where you shouldn't bother looking. Based on that latest map, they were able to find the wreckage on the bottom at 10,000 feet.
It took 2 years for searchers to find the Air France Airbus A330 and its black box recorders in 5,000 square miles of the Atlantic. At its largest, the hunt for MH370 covers just under 3 million square miles, an area roughly the size of the United States. By the beginning of April, searchers from 7 nations are combing an area reduced by probability mapping to 94,500 square miles. Still, 19 times the area of the Air France search, and a zone the size of Britain. Answers lie at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, where depths can reach over 26,000 feet. As deep as Mount Everest is high. Even as the search continues, many wonder, how will this incident change the future of aviation? By the beginning of April 2014, the exhaustive search for Malaysia Flight 370 has turned up many tantalizing leads, but no wreckage and no black box. Experts agree that to have any definitive answer for what happened, they have to locate the plane. And the more days that pass, the harder it becomes.
The recording of flight data is very critical for accident investigations, and this includes basic information about altitude, airspeed, heading, but more importantly, the sounds that were occurring in the cockpit. So one could hear if there's an intruder in the cabin or if there were some sort of unusual action being taken in the cockpit.
To find it, if it's gone underwater, one of the things that you would use is this beacon here, which emits a signal for at least 30 days. You have to have some idea of where the accident site is. So depending on things like the depth of the water, the temperature of the water, you may be able to pick this up from only about 5 miles away. But we're talking about a large area of sea here. You have to have a pretty good idea where you're looking, or you have to be very lucky.
For weeks, searchers scour some 3 million square miles looking for debris from MH370, but find nothing. Despite an intensive international effort, the only firm conclusion is that the plane went down somewhere in the Indian Ocean. But even without a clear answer to this mystery, MH370 has already sparked ideas to prevent future disappearances.
One issue that's already being discussed, and I think it's one of the outcomes of the Air France 447 case, is really looking at the underwater locator beacons. These are pingers on the black boxes. Right now the battery life's only 30 days, so I think longer term batteries on the pinger, so you can go from 30 days maybe to 60 or 90 days life, that would aid in the search.
Another idea is a new kind of black box that can eject itself from a falling plane.
There's now a lot of interest in having a new generation of systems where possibly the aircraft would actually eject a recording unit before impact. So the aircraft would have some sort of system that would recognize that there's an excessive rate of descent and a crash would be imminent, and then it would eject a unit that would both serve as a emergency locator as well as a recording of the critical events of the aircraft before impact.
Perhaps the biggest lesson of MH370 is how easily planes can disappear over open ocean. Already, aviation experts are recommending changes to prevent commercial aircraft from dropping off the map in the future.
Well, the missing link that we didn't have in this search that would really have helped us out is some way to keep track of the aircraft. There are devices out right now, satellite-based GPS trackers that people use when they're hiking or general aviation aircraft will use them. And these very easily obtained commercial units could be formalized and used on these aircraft to provide continuous tracking around the world.
Another future recommendation may be to data link all civil aircraft in flight. This would network all planes in the sky together to cover the blind spots in aircraft tracking revealed in the hunt for MH370.
There's going to have to be some kind of safety reporting system that sends radio signals back that can't be switched off by the crew, and that is protected in much the same way that a black box is protected, so that if there's some onboard fire, it also doesn't get cut off immediately.
It may take years for these new technologies to become accepted and implemented. And even then, none will help solve the enduring mystery of Malaysia 370. For the families and friends of the missing, it's an agonizing dilemma with no end in sight.
As a searcher, what we need to know is where do we need to start looking under the water. Right now, that's what's really hampering our efforts. We have no impact point on the water.
In March 2014, a Boeing 777-200, one of the safest aircraft ever built, vanished. with its 239 passengers and crew, seemingly without leaving a trace. Unless some sign of it is found, we may never know its fate, and that of all on board.
It's going to take a long time to find physical evidence and understand what went on with this aircraft. Right now, we really don't know, and it's almost impossible to estimate how long it's going to take to solve this.
A 747 is flying over the Pacific when suddenly a cargo door explodes open, sucking 9 passengers out of the plane.
It went from a perfectly normal, calm, serene situation to absolute pandemonium.
Another 747, another terrifying incident. The pilots struggled to control the plane for 32 minutes, but it's hopeless.
They faced a condition that no pilot can possibly imagine, which is the airplane's no longer controllable.
A 737 loses a giant chunk of fuselage mid-flight, causing a decompression so powerful it kills a flight attendant.
I saw what I think was the stewardess's feet as she was being sucked out of the plane.
A DC-10 loses an engine on takeoff, causing the plane to roll on its side and nosedive to the ground.
The entire engine had physically separated from the aircraft.
All these disasters have one thing in common. The physical structure of each plane failed, with fatal consequences. What pushed these planes to the breaking point? Whenever a plane goes down, it's the tragic aftermath that usually flashes over and over again around the globe. Scattered wreckage, tattered clues to what may have happened. But now, you're about to become an eyewitness to the accident. Our dramatic animations will put you up close and even inside those troubled planes, right next to passengers experiencing unimaginable terror. In the next hour, jets with extreme failures that can be traced back to the machine's very core or structure.
Structural failures when part of the airplane itself fails. In the worst case, it could be something like a wing actually coming off the airplane, or a tail section, or an engine, or a cargo door.
The structure of the airplane is like the bones in your body, and it holds everything together.
If the airplane structure is the skeleton, then the mechanical parts inside it could be considered the organs. Within the structure, the hydraulic system is comparable to muscle. The electrical system is like the brain, and the pneumatic system like the breath. All 3 of these systems must be in working order for a plane to fly properly. Structural and mechanical failures can often be traced back to problems with the way planes are maintained or inspected. A textbook example, April 28, 1988, when a 737 famously lost part of its fuselage in midair. 1:30 p.m., Aloha Airlines Flight 243 takes off on its 9th inter-island hop of the day. The flight from Hilo to Honolulu should last just 35 minutes. But this 19-year-old Boeing 737 has a major problem. Growing cracks in its skin that are visible, yet they've gone undetected. Patricia Aubrey is sitting in row 17.
We took off. Everything was normal. I always read a book when I'm flying.
To fully understand what's about to happen to Aloha Flight 243, it's critical to know what an airplane goes through every time it flies. Think of the plane's fuselage as a balloon. Every time it goes up, the outside of the plane or the skin expands. That's from the cabin being pressurized so people can breathe at high altitudes where the air is thin. Then, when the plane comes down, the skin contracts. Every takeoff and landing, no matter how long or short the trip, is considered one cycle. And each cycle puts stress on an airplane, potentially causing microscopic cracks.
So you have this constant pressure cycle where it expands, contracts, expands, and contracts. Over a period of time, the metal will eventually start to fatigue because of all of this expansion and contraction, just like a balloon.
As the 737 climbs through 24,000 feet, the cabin pressurizes and the skin of the plane expands just as it's supposed to. But something else expands too, those cracks in the 737's fuselage. Suddenly, there's an explosive decompression. Its force is so powerful, a flight attendant is sucked out of the plane.
I saw what I think was the stewardess's feet as she was being sucked out of the plane. Magazines, briefcases, shoes, you name it, anything that wasn't tied down was going out that hole.
An 18-foot section of the plane is gone. Passengers sitting nearby can see the sky above and the ocean below. All that's holding the 737 together, and just barely, are the floor beams and the plane's belly structure.
About 2 rows in front of me, I could see the floor was buckling up. The plane was bending in the middle.
You can't just have a very strong piece of the bottom of the airplane without having a strong piece of the top. And so when they lost that crown, it really compromised the structural integrity.
The cockpit would move in one direction, and then finally the fuselage would actually bend and then follow it. So it wasn't as though it was a single piece, it actually was bending. They knew they needed on the ground.
Hello, 243, can you give me your souls on board and your fuel on board?
We, 85, 86 plus 5 from your
Roger, how many do you think are injured?
We have no idea, we can stay with our flight attendant.
Okay, we'll have ambulance on the way.
Miraculously, the pilots managed to safely land the plane. These images of Aloha Flight 243 stun people around the globe.
It doesn't seem to make any difference how many times we've seen it today. It is still amazing. An airliner with its fuselage ripped away in midair, and all but one aboard survived. It happened over Hawaii.
There was no bomb explosion or anything, just poofed like a balloon when it exploded and the top came off.
I saw that the plane was falling apart up in the front. Thought we were done.
Earlier that year, the FAA had issued a routine maintenance alert for airlines to detect and repair cracks. Aloha had not yet performed those inspections on its fleet. When a passenger reports after the accident that she had seen a crack near the cabin door as she boarded the plane, it doesn't take long for investigators to figure out what's happened to the 737. It's a 1-2 punch of hot and humid weather and constant ups and downs.
Unlike long-haul flights where you take off at JFK and you fly 8 hours and you land in London, that's one cycle in an 8-hour period. On these island hoppers, you could fly for 2 hours and have 20 cycles, up and down, 30-minute cycles where you pressurize the airplane, take off, fly for 15 minutes, land, then pressurize the airplane again. So the accumulative effect of the cycling of the fuselage is greater in a short period of time than on a long-haul flight where you have one pressurization cycle in an 8-hour period. That was what was really not understood until this particular accident.
We've seen how airplane failures, whether structural or mechanical, can often be traced back to the way planes are maintained or inspected. A tragic case in point, American Airlines Flight 191. The deadliest single airplane crash on U.S. soil. May 25, 1979, the Friday of Memorial Day weekend. A McDonnell Douglas DC-10 is on its way to Los Angeles from Chicago's O'Hare Airport with 258 passengers and 13 crew members on board. Melody Smith and Kim Jockel's parents are on the first leg of a trip to Hawaii.
My mom and dad always had a big kickoff for summer, and so we normally would have been with them. However, they had decided about 6 months before that they were going to Hawaii.
A few minutes before 3 p.m., the plane is cleared to taxi to runway 32 right. At 3:02 p.m., it's cleared for takeoff. Our investigative animations are about to turn you into an eyewitness to a horrific accident. May 25, 1979, the Friday of Memorial Day weekend. American Flight 191, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, is on its way to Los Angeles from Chicago's O'Hare Airport. A few minutes before 3 p.m., the plane is cleared to taxi to runway 32 right. At 3:02 p.m., it's cleared for takeoff. Our investigative animations are about to turn you into an eyewitness to a horrific accident.
The flight crew, Flight 191, starts their normal takeoff roll. As the airplane departs the runway on their normal climb out, they get an indication that they've got an engine failure.
One of the DC-10's wing-mounted engines has ripped away from the plane, flying up and over the left wing. Gone with it are hydraulics and pneumatics, systems critical to controlling the airplane.
The pilots knew they had a very serious problem. They knew the engine had failed, but they didn't know that it had actually come off the airplane. There's no indication for that.
Look at this. Blew up an engine. Equipment. We need equipment. He blew an engine. Oh.
The leading edge slats, which give the wing better lift at slow speeds during takeoff and landing, are controlled hydraulically. Now, with no hydraulic power on the left side, the left slats retract back into the wing.
Which means now he has less lift on that side than he has on the opposite side, so the airplane wants to roll.
An eyewitness manages to snap a photo of American 191 rolled onto its side, with its left wing pointing straight down to the ground. What happens next seals the fate of Flight 191.
Pilots are trained to handle engine failures, and they did what their training taught them to do. They reduced their airspeed.
But when they did that, they no longer had airflow across the flight controls.
They did a very good job of trying to get control of the airplane, but they just didn't have enough altitude or enough time to do it.
The plane staggers up to 325 feet. As it's rolled onto its side and now slowed down, it is uncontrollable and goes into a nosedive.
American 191 Heavy, you want to come back into what runway? Not talking to me. Yeah, we're going to lose a wing. There he goes. There he goes.
Within 31 seconds of the engine severing from the plane, the DC-10 slams into a trailer park less than a mile from the runway. The entire flight has lasted just 2 minutes, but it's changed these sisters' lives forever.
I can still remember you saying, there's no other way to tell you that there's been a really bad accident.
Yeah, and Mom and Dad are dead. And I said, you need to find a way to come home.
There was no noise at all, and the plane just, it went left wingtip right into the ground, and as soon as it hit, it had a napalm effect. It just, everything in its path was just blown into a sheet of flame.
Initially, NTSB investigators are baffled. What could have caused a structural failure of this magnitude?
This is all that was left of American Airlines Flight 191, as far as it got on its way to Los Angeles.
They sift through the wreckage and look to the plane's 2 flight recorders for clues. Within days of the crash, they begin to zero in on a part called the pylon. It has a 13-inch crack they believe was caused by fatigue prior to the crash, which maintenance inspections had missed. To change an engine on the DC-10, the manufacturer recommended detaching the engine from the pylon, but leaving the pylon attached to the wing. At the time, engineers from several airlines were using a shortcut. They found if the engine and pylon assembly were removed in one piece, they could change an engine a lot more quickly.
They would just drop the entire unit from the wing, change the component, put it all back together. In theory, it sounded great. On paper, it looked good.
It's when maintenance workers are reattaching the engine and pylon 8 weeks before the crash, the soon-to-be fatal mistake is made. If the airline had followed manufacturer requirements, workers would have simply reattached the engine to the pylon using a specialized machine recommended by the manufacturer. But because they've removed the massive engine pylon assembly together, now it has to be replaced as one unit. Using a forklift, workers inadvertently crack the top section of the pylon, called the flange, as they try to refit the assembly back onto the plane.
Because they were using a forklift to try and hold this heavy engine up while they put these 2 big bolts in place to hold the pylon on the wing. They created a stress situation that over a period of time when the airplane was returned to service caused one of the bolts to fail.
This morning, investigators were out on runway 32 right at O'Hare Airport looking for a bolt about 4 inches long.
The crack is hidden from view, so it goes undetected. With every takeoff and landing cycle putting stress on the broken flange, the crack is growing, and no one knows it. 8 weeks after the engine change when Flight 191 takes off on that warm spring afternoon, suddenly, without warning, disaster.
When our parents died, initially, we would have all of their friends, a lot of friends saying, well, isn't this wonderful? They went together.
And they were so young,
and they loved one another and whatever. And I can remember at the time I had to kind of choke back saying, no, I don't think this is wonderful.
7 months after the accident, the NTSB issues several critical and immediate recommendations for airlines. Among them, airlines must discontinue the unapproved maintenance practice and inspect pylon attach points on all DC-10s by approved inspection methods. The NTSB also recommends that airlines change their flight manuals so pilots know not to ever reduce speed in such a scenario, as in the case of Flight 191. Neither American Airlines nor McDonnell Douglas ever admitted any fault in this accident. But in April 1981, the two companies agreed to share the cost of settlements in more than 200 lawsuits that were filed. The terms of those settlements remain confidential.
Every accident and incident, because of its unique characteristics, we're always going to learn something. And we have to take those lessons learned. We got to heed those lessons, and we got to enhance aviation safety. We don't want those people to have died in vain.
Coming up next, that cargo door where your luggage goes. Imagine it opening in midair. Our dramatic animations put you at the scene of another heart-stopping structural failure.
I denied it. A denial. Complete, absolute mental denial. This is not happening.
And a plane flying out of control crashes into a mountain. We'll take you deep inside this 747 to discover what went wrong.
That would be a nightmare scenario for a pilot.
Flying requires trust that all the people involved, ground crews, mechanics, pilots, are doing what they're supposed to do. And that the airplane itself will function normally. But for the passengers of this unlucky flight, that trust is about to be shaken when a cargo door explodes open in midair.
In 1989, I was a practicing trial lawyer in Denver. I hadn't had a vacation in about 3 years.
Bruce Lampert is a licensed pilot and an aviation attorney who represents plane crash victims. He never imagined he'd end up experiencing and surviving a deadly incident in the sky.
I had just completed working extensively on Northwest 255, a crash in Detroit, Michigan. I was about to get started on a new case, Continental 1713, in Denver, Colorado, and I had a 3-week break in between those two cases. This was going to be a vacation that I would really remember.
February 24th, 1989, 2 a.m. United Airlines Flight 811 is en route from Honolulu to Auckland, New Zealand. 355 people are on board for the night flight over the Pacific. Takeoff and initial climb are normal.
We were settling in for a restful flight, and the aircraft was climbing.
But as the Boeing 747 approaches 23,000 feet, the shock of a lifetime.
There was an explosion. Everything that wasn't tied down was airborne.
These dramatic animations put you next to the plane as the forward right cargo door rips open in flight, slams upward, creating a gaping hole in the fuselage, and then falls from the plane. The resulting massive depressurization sucks out 2 rows of seats and 9 passengers.
The door swung out. It's an outward opening door. And there's a stop that keeps it from going up all the way. But in flight, the air loads were such that it just kept going right through that stop and went all the way up and slammed against the fuselage above the door. And it actually fractured that fuselage above the door.
In 1 second, their fellow passengers were sitting there with magazines and drinks with their reading lights on. And then a nanosecond later, they were gone.
The structural integrity of the main deck has failed extensively. There's a 10 by 15 foot hole in the fuselage, and debris has been sucked into both engines on that side. The inboard number 3 engine is pulsing fire. Number 4 is also failing. The pilot begins a rapid descent to an altitude where passengers can breathe normally.
They declared an emergency, and en route back to the airport, they had to literally shut down both the number 3 and number 4 engines. So now they're flying this big 4-engine aircraft on 2 engines. That in and of itself is a challenge for any pilot.
For passengers, it's a moment of pure terror. Someone in business class manages to snap this photo as the plane is quickly descending.
You know, everyone likes to think that in a stressful situation that you will act properly, you will act heroically. That you will do the right thing. But when you can do nothing, there's no place to go, there's no place to run. You can't scream because no one can hear you. So what do? You sit there with your hands folded in your lap and you look at the people around you, and there is very little comfort from watching others who are experiencing the same threat that you are.
Then, out of nowhere, there's a sudden glimmer of hope. When any structural element of an airplane fails, the result can be fatal. A 747 has a cargo door blown out in mid-flight. The decompression is so powerful, it sucks 2 rows of seats and 9 passengers out of the plane in a split second.
You can't scream because no one can hear you. So what do? You sit there with your hands folded in your lap and you look at the people around you, and there is very little comfort from watching others who are experiencing the same threat that you are.
Then, out of nowhere, there's a sudden glimmer of hope.
I remember seeing a number of the passengers on the right side pointing to the windows. And if you looked out the window, you could see there were lights. There were the lights of Honolulu, there were lights of Hawaii, and we could see land.
After 20 nerve-wracking minutes, United Flight 811 touches down in Honolulu.
A cheer, like a roller coaster ride, and hands were thrown up above their heads as everybody exclaimed their joy that the airplane had touched down.
This photograph was taken during the evacuation. 346 surviving passengers and crew get off the plane within 1 minute.
And people say, how in the world could everybody get off that quick? And I tell them we had a very highly motivated group of people.
A grinding noise woke me up. There was a bang and a flash. I looked up. The whole right-hand side of the business compartment had gone.
The sound of the explosion, the feeling of the explosion, and the violence of that explosion is awesome. And I hope none of you have to go through it.
It's a tragedy for the families of the 9 passengers who don't survive, and a trauma for the rest. But at least it's over. This video, shot by attorney Bruce Lampert 2 weeks after the fatal accident, documents the aftermath of United Airlines Flight 811. Investigators immediately know the problem centers on the cargo door. They can tell from the gaping hole where it used to be. The key question: why did it explode open, plummeting to the Pacific Ocean below? But the key piece investigators would like to examine, the cargo door itself, is lost at sea. With no hard evidence, the NTSB issues a report 14 months after the accident. Based on previous problems with other 747 cargo doors, the report mentions a possible electrical malfunction. in the cargo door locking mechanisms.
Wreckage is falling out of the ceiling.
But aviation insiders recall most of the blame falling on the Honolulu Airport ground crew.
It's one of the most interesting stories in aviation accident investigation because initially it was thought that the people closing the door had not done it properly and that the door had not been sealed and latched properly.
A number of employees that worked for the airline had come forward after the probable cause saying, of all the individuals that work in Honolulu, this person would be the least likely to not close the door properly. He was known for being very meticulous. But absent any physical evidence to the contrary, the NTSB is bound by facts, and the best estimate of the facts at that time said that he didn't close the door properly.
Is it human error, or is there another explanation?
It wasn't until a year and a half later when the Navy went down and actually found the cargo door, the two pieces of the cargo door, brought them back up, and they were examined, that the real cause or the true cause of the event was identified.
To follow the cargo door failure on United Flight 811, it's important to understand the two-step locking system that secures 747 cargo doors. First, a series of C-shaped latches electronically rotates around pins in the bottom of the door frame. Then, for further reinforcement, a handle moves L-shaped arms called locking sectors up against the C-latches to keep them in place. In addition, there are pins up and down both sides of the door. Normally, all of this holds the door shut, but in the case of United Flight 811, something goes horribly wrong.
A forensic analysis of the door indicated that there was actually a short circuit.
It's an electrical problem that had caused unexpectedly a command to unlock the door to actually come open, so that it was a design issue.
Finding that cargo door obviously was critical to answering this question.
It was so critical that the National Transportation Safety Board actually reissued the report with a different and more up-to-date cause, as well as causing all 747s to be redesigned to prevent this kind of failure from occurring again. So it was a case where the industry learned a very valuable lesson.
The final cause, according to the NTSB, faulty wiring that allowed the properly closed door to unlatch sometime between the closing of the door and takeoff. In other words, it happened on the ground, but the ground crew didn't do it. Before this accident, there were several other documented cases of electrical problems with cargo doors on 747s. In fact, Boeing had alerted airlines to the problem, and the FAA had given airlines nearly 2 years to perform the $2,000 per door upgrade at the airline's expense. When United 811 took off on February 24th, 1989, the deadline was a year away, and the problem was scheduled to be corrected by United 2 months after the accident. To this day, that angers passenger Dick Gutschall, seat 7C.
There was a warning out by the FAA that that door had a problem. United chose not to correct it. That's the only thing that really bothered me, because I still fly United, I still like them. But they made a mistake there. They did not fix the problem when they could have fixed it.
Aviation attorney Bruce Lampert ended up representing about 40 of his fellow passengers in lawsuits against United. Without admitting any wrongdoing, the airline did settle lawsuits for millions of dollars.
As I told the lawyers for United, I would much prefer getting on an airplane where nothing happens and have no cases than to be on an airplane that blows up at 23,000 feet and represent my fellow passengers. I'll make a deal with any airline I fly on. You get me there safely, and I won't represent any passengers.
As we've seen, structural failure on airplanes can be caused by inadequate inspections, faulty maintenance practices, or design flaws buried deep within the guts of these giant machines. But the deadliest single plane crash in history, a 747 that crashed into a Japanese mountainside, had another cause entirely. August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 has a staggering 524 people on board. The plane is set to fly from Tokyo to Osaka. This workhorse of a jet makes the 1-hour trip several times a day. It's like flying from New York to Boston. Suzanne Bailey's boyfriend, Akihisa Yukawa, is on board.
Aki was a banker. He was traveling on business that day. It was a very humid, hot Japanese summer day. From the moment that I opened my eyes that day, and Aki did too, there was a hint of something wrong, which I couldn't explain.
Also on board, Takashi Takeda's sister, Sumiko.
She did tell me that she's going to Tokyo, but I said to her, it's dangerous to fly. She told me, don't worry, brother, I've already bought a ticket.
When we come back, a catastrophic case of structural failure. August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 has a staggering 524 people on board. The plane is set to fly from Tokyo to Osaka. This workhorse of a jet makes the 1-hour trip several times a day. It's like flying from New York to Boston. You're looking at footage of the actual plane involved in this crash, taking off on its final ill-fated flight. 6:12 p.m. Everything seems normal as JAL-123 lifts off and climbs out. But suddenly, 12 minutes into the flight, there's a problem.
They were in the middle 20,000 feet, which is where airplanes experience the most pressure on the vessel itself. At that point, they received a door warning that a door was ajar, which turned out not to be the case.
We've already seen how an airplane's fuselage expands as the plane goes up and contracts as the plane comes down. The altitude with the greatest pressure differential between the pressurized inside of an aircraft and the unpressurized atmosphere outside is right around 24,000 feet. That's where JAL-123 experiences an explosive shock.
A massive decompression for reasons that they didn't know. But the crew did not realize the amount of damage they had sustained until very quickly the airplane became less and less controllable to the point that it was no longer controllable at all. That would be a nightmare scenario for a pilot.
What the pilots don't know is a critical piece of the 747 structure has cracks that have expanded to the breaking point and snapped. It's the aft pressure bulkhead, an umbrella-shaped structure toward the back of the plane.
It is the device that keeps the pressure in the back part of the airplane contained properly.
Without that aft pressure bulkhead, you can't pressurize the tube, and you wouldn't be able to breathe at 35,000 feet without the use of pressurized supplemental oxygen.
The back of the airplane is getting considerable amount of stress, not only from the pressurization, but also from the tail and all the stresses of flight. So that bulkhead is very, very robust. It is a serious piece of structure.
At the moment of the decompression, all the pressurized air from the cabin needs somewhere to go. It blasts back to the cracked bulkhead, and unbeknownst to the pilots, the tremendous force blows the vertical fin and other parts of the tail section right off the giant 747. Critical hydraulic lines are severed in the process.
The first officer makes several radio calls that says that we're in uncontrollable flight. We do not have control of the airplane. They're fighting literally for their lives.
The airplane starts to go into what they call a phugoid, or pitch oscillations up and down, as well as Dutch roll. The airplane starts to swing back and forth. And no matter what the pilot tries to do as far as flight control inputs, he's not having an effect.
The pilots fight desperately for control of the airplane for 32 terrifying minutes. They manage to keep the plane aloft, but with no hydraulics, they can't control the plane's up and down or side-to-side movement. Eyewitnesses on the ground later report the plane was flying, quote, like a staggering drunk. As JAL-123 enters a mountainous region northwest of Tokyo, the plane goes into a nosedive, falling 18,000 feet a minute. Just before 7 p.m., JAL Flight 123 drops off the radar screen. It has slammed into a mountain at nearly 400 miles an hour.
These are the first daylight pictures from the site of what appears to be the worst single airliner crash ever. The Japan Airlines 747 went down in the mountains outside Tokyo. It is believed that all 524 people on board were killed. It is a tragedy with many clues tonight, but no hard answers yet.
It takes rescuers half a day to get to the remote spot where Japan Airlines JAL Flight 123 has slammed into a mountain northwest of Tokyo. When investigators finally reached the crash site, they began combing the wreckage for clues. Miraculously, they find something they didn't expect. 2 women and 2 young girls have survived.
The 4 people that survived the accident were seated in the very aft section of the airplane. So when the airplane struck the ground, the tail section broke from the main section of the fuselage and was thrown well away from the impact point.
Takashi Takeda hoped his sister would be among the survivors. Sadly, as he discovered at a makeshift morgue, that was not the case.
She only had a scar here on the chin. There was no damage to the rest of the body. I recognized her right away.
Testimony from those who did survive will later prove valuable. But in the meantime, there are countless other clues to pursue. Coming up next, investigators face the grim task of piecing together the mystery.
We had a catastrophic scene. We had millions of airplane parts scattered over a mountainside.
It takes rescuers half a day to get to the remote spot where Japan Airlines JAL Flight 123 has slammed into a mountain northwest of Tokyo.
We had millions of airplane parts scattered over a mountainside, but the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, as well as witness statements, all of these different sources of information help investigators put the puzzle together.
Within days, 2 important clues turn up. A photograph taken by an amateur photographer as the plane passed over his village. It reveals the plane flying with part of its tail section missing. And part of that missing tail section, including the vertical fin which keeps the plane stable, is fished out of a bay 100 miles away from the mountain.
It was quite a distance from the crash site, so they knew it had departed the airplane early. So now you begin to ask the question, what could cause a decompression control problem?
A tail strike can occur in one of 2 phases of flight, either on takeoff, where the airplane is on the runway and is beginning its initial climb, or it can occur on landing, where the airplane is in a tail low, nose high attitude. Either way, it's going to create some sort of damage.
The repair of the cracked bulkhead is problematic. The structure is so large, more than 15 feet across, the airplane was originally built around it. To make the fix, Boeing removes the skin of the airplane around the bulkhead, replaces the bulkhead's damaged lower half, then reinstalls the skin of the plane over it. Now the trouble. To fuse the 2 bulkhead halves, Boeing's repair calls for a single splice plate, or doubler. But with the skin of the plane back on, the doubler doesn't fit. Boeing field reps make the call to cut the piece in half. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, the correct procedure calls for 2 rows of rivets to hold that doubler in place. Only 1 row is used. For 7 years, the single row and the split-up panel have been carrying twice the load they should have been.
They decided to alter the installation procedure. It wasn't an approved procedure.
The repair is certified to last 10,000 takeoff landing cycles. By the day of the crash, this particular 747 has already gone more than 12,000 cycles. The repair is inspected, but because a sealant has been used over the gap in the bulkhead, cracks developing between the rivets are not found. This plane is a ticking time bomb.
Unfortunately, the repair was insufficient and cracks started to develop over the service life after the airplane was returned into passenger use. There was no proper inspection procedure as well.
As JAL-123 passes through 24,000 feet, cracks began to connect between the rivets, leading the bulkhead to fail catastrophically. It's a structural failure due not to bad airplane design, but to a faulty repair and inadequate oversight.
When we look back at structural failures, how common is it that it's repair-related or maintenance-related?
As a maintainer, it pains me to say this, but I think we're finding more and more where it's repair-related.
There were at least 2 suicides in the wake of this incident. A Japan Airlines employee who was working with victims' families, and an inspection engineer who issued a certificate of airworthiness for the doomed plane after the 1978 tail strike. To this day, JAL-123 remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in the history of aviation. We've seen the disastrous results of airplanes that are not properly repaired, maintained, or inspected. Japan Airlines Flight 123, American Flight 191, Aloha Flight 243. We've also seen what can happen when a plane has a design flaw, as in the case of United Flight 811. But those flights are the exception, not the rule. Every day, 3 million passengers do land safely.
I'm asked often what's the most dangerous part about flying, and quite literally, it's the drive to the airport.
But for those who survive airplane accidents or whose relatives didn't, those kinds of statistics are of little comfort. They've seen and felt the consequences of structural failure firsthand.
We have manufacturers that make incredible machines, cars, elevators, airplanes, trains. And when you get on these elevators and these trains and these airplanes, you expect them to work. But once that faith in machines is shaken, you have this cynical thought. You know, the question authority bumper sticker? Oh, I suggest one, question technology, and put it on your suitcase.
Berlin. 355 people are on board for the night flight over the Pacific. Takeoff and initial climb are normal.
We were settling in for a restful flight, and the aircraft was climbing.
But as the Boeing 747 approaches 23,000 feet, the shock of a lifetime.
There was an explosion. Everything that wasn't tied down was airborne.
These dramatic animations put you next to the plane as the forward right cargo door rips open in flight, slams upward, creating a gaping hole in the fuselage, and then falls from the plane. The resulting massive depressurization sucks out 2 rows of seats and 9 passengers.
The door swung out. It's an outward opening door. And there's a stop that keeps it from going up all the way. But in flight, the air loads were such that it just kept going right through that stop and went all the way up and slammed against the fuselage above the door. And it actually fractured that fuselage above the door.
In 1 second, their fellow passengers were sitting there with magazines and drinks with their reading lights on. And then a nanosecond later, they were gone.
The structural integrity of the main deck has failed extensively. There's a 10 by 15 foot hole in the fuselage, and debris has been sucked into both engines on that side. The inboard number 3 engine is pulsing fire. Number 4 is also failing. The pilot begins a rapid descent to an altitude where passengers can breathe normally.
They declared an emergency, and en route back to the airport, they had to literally shut down both the number 3 and number 4 engines. So now they're flying this big 4-engine aircraft on 2 engines. That in and of itself is a challenge for any pilot.
For passengers, it's a moment of pure terror. Someone in business class manages to snap this photo as the plane is quickly descending.
You know, everyone likes to think that in a stressful situation that you will act properly, you will act heroically. That you will do the right thing. But when you can do nothing, there's no place to go, there's no place to run. You can't scream because no one can hear you. So what do? You sit there with your hands folded in your lap and you look at the people around you, and there is very little comfort from watching others who are experiencing the same threat that you are.
Then, out of nowhere, there's a sudden glimmer of hope. When any structural element of an airplane fails, the result can be fatal. A 747 has a cargo door blown out in mid-flight. The decompression is so powerful, it sucks 2 rows of seats and 9 passengers out of the plane in a split second.
You can't scream because no one can hear you. So what do? You sit there with your hands folded in your lap and you look at the people around you, and there is very little comfort from watching others who are experiencing the same threat that you are.
Then, out of nowhere, there's a sudden glimmer of hope.
I remember seeing a number of the passengers on the right side pointing to the windows. And if you looked out the window, you could see there were lights. There were the lights of Honolulu, there were lights of Hawaii, and we could see land.
After 20 nerve-wracking minutes, United Flight 811 touches down in Honolulu.
A cheer, like a roller coaster ride, and hands were thrown up above their heads as everybody exclaimed their joy that the airplane had touched down.
This photograph was taken during the evacuation. 346 surviving passengers and crew get off the plane within 1 minute.
And people say, how in the world could everybody get off that quick? And I tell them we had
a specialized machine recommended by the manufacturer. But because they've removed the massive engine pylon assembly together, now it has to be replaced as one unit. Using a forklift, workers inadvertently crack the top section of the pylon, called the flange, as they try to refit the assembly back onto the plane.
Because they were using a forklift to try and hold this heavy engine up while they put these 2 big bolts in place to hold the pylon on the wing. They created a stress situation that over a period of time when the airplane was returned to service caused one of the bolts to fail.
This morning, investigators were out on runway 32 right at O'Hare Airport looking for a bolt about 4 inches long.
The crack is hidden from view, so it goes undetected. With every takeoff and landing cycle putting stress on the broken flange, the crack is growing, and no one knows it. 8 weeks after the engine change, when Flight 191 takes off on that warm spring afternoon, suddenly, without warning, disaster.
When our parents died, initially, we would have all of their friends, a lot of friends saying, well, isn't this wonderful? They went together.
And they were so young.
And they loved one another and whatever. And I can remember at the time I had to kind of choke back saying, no, I don't think this is wonderful.
7 months after the accident, the NTSB issues several critical and immediate recommendations for airlines. Among them, airlines must discontinue the unapproved maintenance practice and inspect pylon attach points on all DC-10s by approved inspection methods. The NTSB also recommends that airlines change their flight manuals so pilots know not to ever reduce speed in such a scenario, as in the case of Flight 191. Neither American Airlines nor McDonnell Douglas ever admitted any fault in this accident. But in April 1981, the two companies agreed to share the cost of settlements in more than 200 lawsuits that were filed. The terms of those settlements remain confidential.
Every accident and incident, because of its unique characteristics, we're always going to learn something. And we have to take those lessons learned. We got to heed those lessons, and we got to enhance aviation safety. We don't want those people to have died in vain.
Coming up next, that cargo door where your luggage goes. Imagine it opening in midair. Our dramatic animations put you at the scene of another heart-stopping structural failure.
I denied it. Denial. Complete, absolute mental denial. This is not happening.
And a plane flying out of control crashes into a mountain. We'll take you deep inside this 747 to discover what went wrong.
That would be a nightmare scenario for a pilot.
Flying requires trust that all the people involved, ground crews, mechanics, pilots, are doing what they're supposed to do. And that the airplane itself will function normally. But for the passengers of this unlucky flight, that trust is about to be shaken when a cargo door explodes open in midair.
In 1989, I was a practicing trial lawyer in Denver. I hadn't had a vacation in about 3 years.
Bruce Lampert is a licensed pilot and an aviation attorney who represents plane crash victims. He never imagined he'd end up experiencing and surviving a deadly incident in the sky.
I had just completed working extensively on Northwest 255, a crash in Detroit, Michigan. I was about to get started on a new case, Continental 1713, in Denver, Colorado, and I had a 3-week break in between those two cases. This was going to be a vacation that I would really remember.
February 24th, 1989, 2 a.m. United Airlines Flight 811 is en route from Honolulu to Auckland, New Zealand. Climbs through 24,000 feet. The cabin pressurizes, and the skin of the plane expands, just as it's supposed to. But something else expands too. Those cracks in the 737's fuselage. Suddenly, there's an explosive decompression. Its force is so powerful, a flight attendant is sucked out of the plane.
I saw what I think was the stewardess's feet as she was being sucked out of the plane. Magazines, briefcases, shoes, you name it, anything that wasn't tied down was going out that hole.
An 18-foot section of the plane is gone. Passengers sitting nearby can see the sky above and the ocean below. All that's holding the 737 together, and just barely, are the floor beams and the plane's belly structure.
About 2 rows in front of me, I could see the floor was buckling up. The plane was bending in the middle.
You can't just have a very strong piece of the bottom of the airplane without having a strong piece of the top. And so when they lost that crown, it really compromised the structural integrity.
The cockpit would move in one direction, and then finally the fuselage would actually bend and then follow it. So it wasn't as though it was a single piece. It actually was bending. They knew they needed on the ground.
Hello, 243. Can you give me your souls on board and your fuel on board?
85, 86.
Roger. How many do you think are injured?
We have no idea. We can stay with our flight attendant.
Okay, we'll have ambulance on the way.
Miraculously, the pilots managed to safely land the plane. These images of Aloha Flight 243 stun people around the globe.
It doesn't seem to make any difference how many times we've seen it today. It is still amazing. An airliner with its fuselage ripped away in midair, and all but one aboard survived. It happened over Hawaii.
There was no bomb explosion or anything, just pooped like a balloon when it exploded and the top came off.
I saw that the plane was falling apart up in the front. Thought we were done.
Early Earlier that year, the FAA had issued a routine maintenance alert for airlines to detect and repair cracks. Aloha had not yet performed those inspections on its fleet. When a passenger reports after the accident that she had seen a crack near the cabin door as she boarded the plane, it doesn't take long for investigators to figure out what's happened to the 737. It's a 1-2 punch of hot and humid weather and constant ups and downs.
Unlike long-haul flights where you take off at JFK and you fly 8 hours and you land in London, that's one cycle in an 8-hour period. On these island hoppers, you could fly for 2 hours and have 20 cycles, up and down, 30-minute cycles where you pressurize the airplane, take off, fly for 15 minutes, land, then pressurize the airplane again. So the accumulative effect of the cycling of the fuselage is greater in a short period of time than on a long-haul flight where you have one pressurization cycle in an 8-hour period. That was what was really not understood until this particular accident.
We've seen how airplane failures, whether structural or mechanical, can often be traced back to the way planes are maintained or inspected. A tragic case in point, American Airlines Flight 191, the deadliest single airplane crash on U.S. soil. May 25, 1979, the Friday of Memorial Day weekend. A McDonnell Douglas DC-10 is on its way to Los Angeles from Chicago's O'Hare Airport with 258 passengers and 13 crew members on board. Melody Smith and Kim Jockel's parents are on the first leg of a trip to Hawaii.
My mom and dad always had a big kickoff for summer, and so we normally would have been with them. However, they had decided about 6 months before that they were going to Hawaii.
A few minutes before 3 p.m., the plane is cleared to taxi to runway 32 right. At 3:02 p.m., it's cleared for takeoff. Our investigative animations are about to turn you into an eyewitness to a horrific accident. May 25, 1979, the Friday of Memorial Day weekend. American Flight 191, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, is on its way to Los Angeles from Chicago's O'Hare Airport. A few minutes before 3 p.m., the plane is cleared to taxi to runway 32 right. At 3:02 p.m., it's cleared for takeoff. Our investigative animations are about to turn you into an eyewitness to a horrific accident.
The flight crew, Flight 191, starts their normal takeoff roll. As the airplane departs the runway on their normal climb out, they get an indication that they've got an engine failure.
One of the DC-10's wing-mounted engines has ripped away from the plane, flying up and over the left wing. Gone with it are hydraulics and pneumatics, systems critical to controlling the airplane.
The pilots knew they had a very serious problem. They knew the engine had failed, but they didn't know that it had actually come off the airplane. There's no indication for that.
Look at this, look at this. Blew up an engine, equipment, you need equipment, you blew an engine. Oh.
The leading edge slats, which give the wing better lift at slow speeds during takeoff and landing, are controlled hydraulically. Now, with no hydraulic power on the left side, the left slats retract back into the wing.
Which means now he has less lift on that side than he has on the opposite side, so the airplane wants to roll.
An eyewitness manages to snap a photo of American 191 rolled onto its side with its left wing pointing straight down to the ground. What happens next seals the fate of Flight 191.
Pilots are trained to handle engine failures, and they did what their training taught them to do. They reduced their airspeed.
But when they did that, they no longer had airflow across the flight controls.
They did a very good job of trying to get control of that airplane, but they just didn't have enough altitude or enough time to do it.
The plane staggers up to 325 feet. As it's rolled onto its side and now slowed down, it is uncontrollable and goes into a nosedive.
American 191 Heavy, you want to come back into what runway? Not talking to me. Yeah, he's going to lose a wing. There he goes. There he goes.
Within 31 seconds of the engine severing from the plane, the DC-10 slams into a trailer park less than a mile from the runway. The entire flight has lasted just 2 minutes, but it's changed these sisters' lives forever.
I can still remember you saying, there's no other way to tell you that there's been a really bad accident.
Yeah, and Mom and Dad are dead. And I said, you need to find a way to come home.
There was no noise at all, and the plane just, it went left wingtip right into the ground, and as soon as it hit, it had a napalm effect. It just, everything in its path was just blown into a sheet of flame.
Initially, NTSB investigators are baffled. What could have caused a structural failure of this magnitude?
This is all that was left of American Airlines Flight 191, as far as it got on its way to Los Angeles.
They sift through the wreckage and look to the plane's 2 flight recorders for clues. Within days of the crash, they begin to zero in on a part called the pylon. It has a 13-inch crack they believe was caused by fatigue prior to the crash, which maintenance inspections had missed. To change an engine on the DC-10, the manufacturer recommended detaching the engine from the pylon, but leaving the pylon attached to the wing. At the time, engineers from several airlines were using a shortcut. They found if the engine and pylon assembly were removed in one piece, they could change an engine a lot more quickly.
They would just drop the entire unit from the wing, change the component, put it all back together. In theory, it sounded great. On paper, it looked good.
It's when maintenance workers are reattaching the engine and pylon 8 weeks before the crash, the soon-to-be fatal mistake is made. If the airline had followed manufacturer requirements, workers would have simply reattached the engine to the pylon using... A 747 is flying over the Pacific when suddenly a cargo door explodes open, sucking 9 passengers out of the plane.
It went from a perfectly normal, calm, serene situation to absolute pandemonium.
Another 747, another terrifying incident. The pilots struggled to control the plane for 32 minutes, but it's hopeless.
They faced a condition that no pilot can possibly imagine, which is the airplane's no longer controllable.
A 737 loses a giant chunk of fuselage mid-flight, causing a decompression so powerful it kills a flight attendant.
I saw what I think was the stewardess's feet as she was being sucked out of the plane.
A DC-10 loses an engine on takeoff, causing the plane to roll on its side and nosedive to the ground.
The entire engine had physically separated from the aircraft.
All these disasters have one thing in common. The physical structure of each plane failed, with fatal consequences. What pushed these planes to the breaking point? Whenever a plane goes down, it's the tragic aftermath that usually flashes over and over again around the globe. Scattered wreckage, tattered clues to what may have happened. But now, you're about to become an eyewitness to the accident. Our dramatic animations will put you up close and even inside those troubled planes, right next to passengers experiencing unimaginable terror. In the next hour, jets with extreme failures that can be traced back to the machine's very core or structure.
Structural failures when part of the airplane itself fails. In the worst case, it could be something like a wing actually coming off the airplane, or a tail section, or an engine, or a cargo door.
The structure of the airplane is like the bones in your body, and it holds everything together.
If the airplane structure is the skeleton, then the mechanical parts inside it could be considered the organs. Within the structure, the hydraulic system is comparable to muscle. The electrical system is like the brain, and the pneumatic system like the breath. All 3 of these systems must be in working order for a plane to fly properly. Structural and mechanical failures can often be traced back to problems with the way planes are maintained or inspected. A textbook example, April 28, 1988, when a 737 famously lost part of its fuselage in midair. 1:30 p.m., Aloha Airlines Flight 243 takes off on its 9th inter-island hop of the day. The flight from Hilo to Honolulu should last just 35 minutes. But this 19-year-old Boeing 737 has a major problem. Growing cracks in its skin that are visible, yet they've gone undetected. Patricia Aubrey is sitting in row 17.
We took off. Everything was normal. I always read a book when I'm flying.
To fully understand what's about to happen to Aloha Flight 243, it's critical to know what an airplane goes through every time it flies. Think of the plane's fuselage as a balloon. Every time it goes up, the outside of the plane or the skin expands. That's from the cabin being pressurized so people can breathe at high altitudes where the air is thin. Then, when the plane comes down, the skin contracts. Every takeoff and landing, no matter how long or short the trip, is considered one cycle. And each cycle puts stress on an airplane, potentially causing microscopic cracks.
So you have this constant pressure cycle where it expands, contracts, expands, and contracts. Over a period of time, the metal will eventually start to fatigue because of all of this expansion and contraction, just like a balloon.
As the 737
I was an air traffic controller working in the air traffic control center at Shannon Airport.
Air India 182 Shannon, D. Reid.
The last transmission I made to flight Air India 182 was Squawk Alpha 2005.
2005.
That was the last transmission made and received on frequency. There was one fleeting moment on the tape where there was a loud, long, continuous noise, but no voice.
Air India 182 Shannon.
I'm transmitted on 3 or 4 occasions. Air India 182 Shannon, do you read?
Air India 182 Shannon.
Unfortunately, I received no reply on my frequency.
India 182 has gone off the scope. Where'd you last have him? 269.
No one to this day has ever determined whether it was static or the aircraft in trouble trying to transmit to me. To this day, we don't know.
My grandmother was ill. My father wanted to go see her before she had passed.
here. Oh, there's another one going over there. Look at that.
He wanted to definitely see his mother, but at the time, something didn't seem right. My father had never gone anywhere leaving us behind before, like anywhere. It's just, at that time, I don't know what it was, but it didn't seem right. Something didn't seem right. You know, even his friends were saying, like, there's a lot going on in India, you know, just be careful. Dayal Johal, he was well known at the temple. I remember him. I remember meeting him. When they asked him, you know, how come you're here, are you flying? You know, it was quite early in the morning, I believe, and he didn't really have an answer. And just kind of like, you know, moved on, walked away, and that was it.
The father was quite concerned. I believe he purchased an additional $400,000 life insurance. He was concerned because he knew that Dayal Johal was a Babar Khalsa member, and it is a militant Sikh extremist organization. At that time, Babar Khalsa was announcing the fact that planes would fall from the sky, Air India planes would fall from the sky, and warned people not to travel with Air India aircraft.
In 1984, the Indian government and their security forces mounted Operation Blue Star, targeted the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And the Indian government's actions around that particular event had an effect of galvanizing overseas Sikh communities everywhere, and particularly what we term the Sikh extremist communities. Those individuals among the Sikh communities that held to the notion of a separate state of Khalistan.
People were very angry. Loved ones may have been killed, temple was interfered with. So people were susceptible to the kind of preaching that went on, which was essentially for a violent response to the government of India.
I think it's fair to say that the principal extremist or pro-Khalistani group at that time would have been the Babar Khalsa. And it was widely understood that Talwinder Singh Parmar was the leader of the Babar Khalsa in Canada. Talwinder Parmar was assigned a very high level of investigation, the highest we had at the time. So the profile would have been, in accordance with our assessment, that Talwinder Singh Parmar represented us, his activities represented a very serious threat to the security of Canada. Was there an appreciation that we were dealing with a terrorist organization here who has killed, or which has killed? Yeah, that was understood.
asked me if his bags were checked through to New Delhi. And he said, I'm not. He says, I phoned them this morning. I'm confirmed on Air India. I said, you may be confirmed on their computer, but you're not confirmed on our computer.
But it's not on our computer. When you get to Toronto, check in with Air India.
Oh no, what do you mean? When I live in Toronto, I have to pick up my luggage, take my luggage to the Air India and rebook it?
Yes.
Oh no, it's a big hassle for me. I paid full fare for the ticket.
I understand, sir, but...
He did say, I paid full fare for my ticket, and he was a business class passenger in the business class lineup, which gives him privileges.
Okay, here. It's okay. You know what? I'll take care of it.
And I did change the baggage tag to read Toronto, Montreal, Delhi on Air India.
Thank you.
Have a safe flight.
Unfortunately, that's one of the things in my life that I see in slow motion all the time is me ripping off the orange Toronto baggage tag and putting on the pink interline tag, which would transfer it over to Air India.
Ray is a tightly wound guy. Ray is living this file. This investigation is not a 9-to-5 thing for Ray Cobsey. This is his life. Knowing Ray was going crazy at this time because we had a finite number of resources and there was intense competition between operational branches for those resources. It sounds trite to say that it was a very busy time for our counterterrorism program, but that's the fact of the matter. Ray was deeply concerned that if he could not investigate Talwinder Singh Parmar to the depth that he needed to investigate, he was going to do something.
There was a lot of toing and froing a day or two before because, of course, we were trying to actively get them on that flight. No, they weren't originally booked on the connecting CP flight to make Flight 182. Just so awful to think of it now. I can remember my aunt using a phrase, oh, it's just heartbreaking now. You know, it's a saying in Islam, inshallah, if it be the will of Allah, you know, inshallah, we'll meet again.
We were sisters. Zev was always happy and adored by all of us. She was starred in every way. Yes, she was. And at the same time, she will never tell anybody that she's a doctor. Unless it comes up or anything. She was the most humble person I know.
And I remember my mom just not letting my aunt go. They just kept touching each other's hands through the glass. I really remember that. And feeling frustrated, feeling embarrassed, you know, and just saying, okay, bye to my aunt and uncle. And we never, it just wouldn't even occur to us that we'd never see them again, ever.
The last time I saw my father was after checking in. I remember this one part where you check in and then you go to the gate, and then when you're leaving from the gate, you walk. There's this part you walk and you can see everybody walking to the airplane. I just remember my dad waving.
This is a final boarding call for passenger MC on flight.
That was the last time he waved goodbye. That's all I remember.
When she left, I was very restless, just almost suffocating. In a flash, I saw my sister, her hands outstretched like that. And it was so real what she was wearing when she left. I just saw her there, stretched her arms.
Stages of a plan. It's the nature of the terrorist beast that the plan has not crossed the line into criminality. If you look at the activities that go into mounting a terrorist organization, apart from conspiracy, those activities are benign in the extreme. And unless the intelligence that you have, or the criminal intelligence that you have, contains a degree of specificity, that conspiracy doesn't have a hope in hell of passing muster in a criminal court. So fundamentally, you have to let these conspiracies run a long way before you make intervention. I call this the 60 minutes to boom phenomenon. When you are leading a counterterrorism investigation, you effectively have to take a terrorist conspiracy 60 minutes to boom to have a realistic shot at a successful prosecution. And that's just the way it is. We didn't know what that bang was. We didn't know if it was a report of a rifle or a detonation. And there were some conflicting assessments around that by the people that heard it. Was the bang in the bush in Duncan? Was that our 60 minutes to boom and we missed that opportunity?
My mother, Borsha Kelly, was accepted to do her PhD at a university in India, and that's why she was going back. I was, your typical Canadian kid. I was born here and raised here, and just your average Canadian teenager, My mom actually said, you should come to India with me, and you'll have the whole summer. We can just bum around India, but something inside me knew that I shouldn't run away from my problems. So
I didn't go, which, you know, gladly, thankfully I didn't go. I remember I had to go to work and saying goodbye to her at the door, and I remember her saying that she would be back before I knew it. And she used to say to me and my sister, you know, I'm in the prime of my life. She used to say that at 48, you know, this is the prime of my life.
Where we at? Oh, is that you, Doug? How's it going under here? Oh, good, good.
When I first met Inderjeet Rayat, he was working in my truck.
Yeah.
Found him to be a very personable fella.
Perfect timing. So it's giving you a lot of trouble.
I was a corporal on the Duncan General Investigation Section, and I received a phone call from Ray Cobsey, and he told me that he was with CSIS. To be honest, at that time, CSIS had just formed, and I had to do a bit of thinking to bring out what CSIS was in my mind, which I did. And his inquiry was to do some discrete background checks on Inderjeet Rayat. Inderjeet Rayat seemed to me like a nice family man. I had 5 children. I believe he had 4 children. Seemed to have a lot of the same goals in life and whatnot, and we just seemed to be one of those deals where we got along well with each other. Personalities sort of clicked, and we had some good conversations. And as the investigation started to unfold, I certainly started to see a different person. It was certainly not just for myself, but for all police agencies in this country. It was a learning curve about terrorism and what a terrorist is really like.
We started towards Toronto. It was raining like anything, storm coming. We were fighting quite a bit. And that didn't make any sense why we were fighting. Anu was just kept on saying, I know, Dad, that we are going and you're going to be alone. With a kid did not understand that. And even truthfully saying up till now, even I don't understand that, why it was happening. Maybe God wants us to be angry enough that we started hating each other. If something happens, we don't love. I don't know.
In this group of associates that Talwyn or Parmar had, you had a bunch of like-minded individuals who got together and plotted actions and planned for the future of Khalistan. You're talking about Hardial Johal, Surjan Singh Gill, Inderjeet Rayat, Rapudaman Malik, all of the names that have surfaced in the context of the Air India conspiracy. When we talk about his close circle of contacts, that's who we're talking about. Rapudaman Malik, to the extent that there was a money guy associated with BK, Rapudaman Malik was that guy. To bring life to the Babar Khalsa and to support terrorist activities of the Babar Khalsa. Malik was a good candidate to go into that role.
Najib Singh Bagri is the Babar Khalsa leader. His views on achieving an independent Khalistan are very similar to Malik's.
ਹੁਣ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੋਰ ਕੁਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਕਰਾਉਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਬਹੁਤ ਕੁਝ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ 50,000 ਤੋਂ ਉੱਤੇ ਨੌਜਵਾਨ ਸ਼ਹੀਦ ਹੋ ਚੁੱਕਾ ਹੈ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਭਰਾ ਕਈਆਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਮੈਂ ਆਪ ਨੂੰ ਭਰੋਸਾ ਦਿਵਾਉਣਾ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਚਿਰ ਤੱਕ 50,000 ਹਿੰਦੂ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਤਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਸਾਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੰਮੂਗੇ.
These are very bellicose individuals. There was not a day that went by when Sikh extremists were not going to kill somebody or blow something up.
There were many instances where people spoke up and they were threatened, physically manhandled, and they changed their stance the next day. It was a state of fear that existed in the community at that time.
People have phoned me and said they're going to liquidate me. That's the political jargon. They will reform me. That's what they've been saying literally in Punjabi, which means they will kill me.
I felt, and others felt, that the government of the day, the political establishment of the day, and even the law enforcement establishment, not the people on the beat, on the ground, but the actual established leadership, did not feel that there was a problem. That, you know, here were some brown guys, some with turbans, others without turbans, killing each other or hurting each other or making fiery speeches about something that was 15,000 miles away. It didn't affect anybody else in the society. It doesn't matter.
Just as we were approaching the airport, the rain stopped. I was very worried. I said, you know, with this storm and all, taking like the planes going out and all that. And my husband said, what time are you living in? He said, this type of rain doesn't bother the big airplanes. But it just felt very comforting that everything had cleared up.
It was a beautiful day. It was not an extremely busy day, which sometimes you can get busy periods in the international flights. This was a nice day.
Okay, you're going to go this way. And there, and your gate's just that way.
School was out, and these were all Canadian children that were going home to meet with the grandparents or go home for their summer holiday. A lot of young people.
It was entirely their decision because they thought they were old enough to travel on their own and connect with the family entirely on their own. My oldest son, Devin, had written on his calendar, return to homeland, you know, a little thing on the 23rd of June. Yeah.
We had two very talented young daughters, and my life revolved around my family. It was our hope that, you know, they would grow up to be really productive, good Canadians. There was this odd coincidence about all 5 young women being dancers, traveling together, and Vishnu was going to be this one chaperone of these 5 young women, and we teased him about it, and he kept saying, I'm going to get a seat so far away from these 5 boisterous young women, you know, so that I can travel in peace. We traveled, always together. This was one of the first times that we weren't all together.
Beautiful suit you have. What a great color.
There was one young girl that came up. She was dressed in blue. She was, I think, probably 22 years old. And she said, it's my first trip over there, and I really wanted to look so nice. So we assured her that she looked so beautiful, and
can't guarantee the safety of Mr. Gallagher without the support from headquarters. Well, with all due respect, sir, we have an emergent situation taking place here in the field.
सौ दिन नोट कर लो ये लोग ऐसे क्यों आ गए फोन पे बात मत करो
So if you're Ray Cobsey, you know, you breathe a sigh of relief, you say finally, and you start hoping and praying that what derives from resources that he now has will in some way advance your investigation beyond where it was before you got that resource allocated to you. The more sources that you have working against the target, the greater the prospect that you're going to find that critical nugget, that very valuable singular piece of intelligence, actionable intelligence, if you will. He's now got a critical mass of information starting to come together, pointing to the fact that the Barbara-Calson in Canada is planning something.
I liked everything about him. He looked very, very handsome in uniform, tall, very handsome Sikh gentleman, and very fit to look at, very intelligent. He was very ambitious. His friends always thought that one day he will be the managing director of Air India with his qualifications, his background, and his intelligence. There is no one like him.
We are saying bye. We hug each other. And I'm telling the kid, take care of your mom. On the same time, I'm telling the mom, take care of the kids. This is the first time that a person is going out of country and I'm not there with them. And I turn around and see from the other side there was another line standing for British Airways. Surprisingly, there were almost 80% people with a turban. And I asked that friend of mine, how come all the Sikhs are over here? And they were not in Air India. The only 2 people went to Air India. Why? He said, you know that the Sikh people have boycotted Air India. I wanted to see my family at that minute. Something was pushing me to see them. I do not know what to do. They won't let me in. And I dread that moment. I let them go.
One of the things that does stand out in my mind about this investigation is the piece of evidence where Mr. Rayat went to the store. He had the battery, the relay, and I believe it was a light of some type, and the time clock. When it went off at the set time, it blinked. And his goal was to have a solid beacon instead of the blinking beacon. So I just picture in my mind this fellow walking in the store that's, as evidence suggests, building a bomb, walking into the store with this contraption and asking these questions and help to do this.
Ready?
Certainly, that's one of the things I really recall, and it's just unusual for somebody doing that caliber of crime to do that.
So you want a few sticks? Yes, please.
Canadian police agencies, we were in our infancy as far as terrorism investigations. Police officers at the time, I mean, yes, Canada has our great Canadian mosaic today. Back in 1985, I don't think the police were any different. In East India, and we didn't know the difference between what is a Punjabi, what is Sikh, what is Hindu, Khalistan, what is that? Where's India? Like, here you have a conspirator walking around and telling people about his concerns back in India, and he has to do something, and very overtly doing things, which is laying an evidentiary trail.
Big explosion from 2 sticks, I can't believe it.
At that time, the assets and interests of the government of India occupied the highest threat level that we had. What do you do? Unless you have intelligence that says specifically these individuals associated with this organization intend to place a bomb constructed in this fashion on this aircraft leaving Toronto on this day and at this time, what can you do?
It was really, really hectic in there. And there was a lot of pressure on those people. Get things moving, get it moving. We've got to get that plane in the air. Load the luggage on and on your way. Most airlines don't like to see one of their aircraft just sitting idle.
Sanjay is the older one, and he was very gentle. His teachers describe him as a holy man. My younger one, Deepak, was bright too. He too was an honest student, but he was full of life, full of laughter, full of mischief. I used to say, I have 2 hands, one's Sanjay, one's Deepak. I have 2 eyes, one's Sanjay and one's Deepak. One has got foresight and the other one is the light of my life, because Deepak means light. He was born on Diwali. Deepak said bye, and then that's it. He went off straight with the kids. He was laughing, jumping, running.
Wait for me, guys.
And Sanjay came to me and said, Mom, look after Dad. Sanjay said this, and then he went forward, said goodbye, went forward, said goodbye. He turned back 20 times before he turned off. The kids were ahead of him and they went away, and the lady went with them. But this son of mine turned back 20 times, and then I began to feel agitated, and I said, Babu, what is this? This is not normal.
I don't know.
There were concerns that the Babar Khalsa may orchestrate some type of a plot to either assassinate Rajiv Gandhi or cause him harm. So that was a meeting done by the RCMP and the security service in the States.
I know nothing. Okay?
To see if they would tell them anything concerning what they knew about certain individuals, and also to let them know that they were being watched.
The machine was broken down on that day, so the bags could not pass through the scanner.
Everybody come here, everybody.
The security guy came downstairs and explained to the security people what they should do and gave them a hand wand to check the suitcases. The security manager, he lit a match and he passed the wand on top, and then it came beep. That's the noise you look for.
Okay, now take this and move this one.
That was only the first time I've seen in 25 years that they used the wand downstairs to scan bags.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to apologize for the delay in boarding Air India Flight 182, soon departing for Delhi via Montreal and London Heathrow. We thank you for your patience and we will keep you updated. Mesdames et messieurs, veuillez accepter nos excuses pour le délai.
There was quite a number of children on board the flight, and this is the most vivid memories I have, personally. The one that keeps coming back is the little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7. And she was clutching a big box of chocolates. And I can still see that little face. I was joking with her all the way to the gate that you better give me that box of chocolate because they're going to be melted before we get there. Oh no, sir. Oh no, I'll keep them.
वाहिगुरू खालसा वाहिगुरू फतेह खालसा जी कहानी लिखती नहीं होने करो
CPR, good afternoon. Well, Air India travels Toronto, Delhi via Montreal. I can put you on a non-stop Air India 182.
हाँ जी मैं कहानी लिखती है जी ठीक है लिखना चाहोगे हाँ घर ही आ जाओ मैं घर ही हूँ ठीक है हाँ जी वाहिगुरू जी का
The wiretaps consisted of Talwinder Singh Parmar right up until June 23rd, 1985. That was a major problem for the CSIS at that time, to have enough resources to translate the tapes that they had intercepted, to have them translated quickly and properly.
खालसा वाहिगुरू फतेह खालसा जी कहानी लिखती नहीं होने करो ठीक हाँ जी मैं कहानी लिखती है जी ठीक है
What does that mean to you as a reasonable man? Have you written the story yet? The fact that something I don't understand is followed by a call to a CPR office does not present to me a eureka moment saying, oh my God, they bought tickets for a CPR flight and they're going to put a bomb on that plane. That doesn't follow in any reasonable man's reality. You know, so that's the eyes that we're looking at this with. Have you written the story? What does that mean?
light came down, the guy went with the scanner. So it came beep, beep in the center. And then he turned around to the girl who was in charge, security girl. So she said, that's okay, she says. He looked at me and he did this, so I did this also, you know. So I lifted that bag, I put it on a cart. I strongly feel they should have checked that one bag.
Sense of relief, but it's very short-lived. You say, okay, Gandhi lives to fight another day, but there's still something else going on there, and we need to know what it is. So, you don't see a lot of celebration in our business. You go back to square one and you say, well, it wasn't that. It had to be something else. Okay, if it's not Gandhi, then what?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We apologize for our delay. Welcome aboard Air India Flight 182. En route to New Delhi via Montreal and London Heathrow.
I've seen what bombs do to bodies. I've seen what falling from great heights will do to a human body. I've seen what burning flesh looks like and smells like. This is not an ethereal concept. People die, and nobody should ever lose sight of the fact that if you make mistakes, there can be tragic consequences. You need to remember that all the time because it galvanizes you. It makes you personalize your investigations, and it makes you do everything that you possibly can to make sure that people don't die.
I was a good girl. I had done what I was asked to do, which was to put on a certain amount of weight so I could be rewarded with a weekend pass so I could attend my sister's funeral, graduation.
You know, we were just having some parting words and some joking around. Oh, it was a big hug, definitely. Yeah. And, you know, you sort of, and after sight, you think, oh, you know, why didn't I say I love you, or I didn't, you know.
There are certain things that, you know, you remember very vividly, very, very clearly. You can't forget them. And this, of course, is one of the, because, you know, it's not really kind of, I didn't think of it, you know, that this might be the last time I'm seeing them.
I didn't want them to go. I did feel like she was abandoning me. I think. And I just remember that she was very excited to leave, and she was very happy. The last thing she said to me was, "Be strong. Be strong like your sister."
हेलो भाई खालसा भाई फतेह जी
चिट्ठी भेज दी
हाँ जी
चिट्ठी तो मैं कल सी चंगा जी सत श्री अकाल
खालसा भाई फतेह जी हाँ जी खालसा जी टीवी देख रहे हो जी हर पासे वही खबर ने हाँ जी कितने बरीटा
Shannon. Air India 182 Shannon, do you read? There's an Air India 182 at this time. He's not talking to us. Can you see anything ahead of you there?
33, and I saw a piece of the contrail out the left side that looked like it might have been a 31, but quickly no airplane hit.
You don't see anything there?
At this point, we're very worried. We're very worried. We tried every means humanly possible to re-establish contact with the aircraft. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Air India Flight 182 is now missing.
The phone had awakened my sister and I, and we were sort of groggy. It was very early on a Sunday morning, a beautiful, quiet Sunday morning in June, and suddenly my mom's screaming. Oh, it was a scream really like I've never heard. Like it was just awful. I don't think I'll ever forget those screams. No, I know I won't.
We're still very much hoping that someone's still alive and that we're going to see someone who, even if they're not waving, looks like they're alive and possibly able to be rescued. And we're still desperately hoping that someone's going to have got out of this, because sometimes people do. That's a pretty slim hope, but that is the big hope.
He said to me, "It's the boys' flight." And I said, "What happened to the flight?" And he said, "They're saying that it disappeared and there are no survivors." And I said, "I can't be." I said, "That can't be."
It was a bit of an adventure, to be honest. It was, we had, certainly I had this mental image of this small aircraft floating on the sea and people standing on the fuselage sort of thing, and we would roll up and pluck them all from the sea into safety.
He went to the phone, he said, yes, the children were on the plane. And he says, all's gone, and collapsed. And I got out of the bed and said, "Don't cry like a lady, like a girl," I said that, and I ran to the television, turned it on.
Programs normally seen at this time have been cancelled or rescheduled so that we may present the following CBC News special.
It's one of the worst air disasters ever, and it's taken more Canadian lives than any other crash in history. Air India Flight 182 simply disappeared from radar screens off the coast of Ireland. On board were 329 people. More than 280 of them were Canadians. At least 86 of the passengers were children. It is almost certain that no one survived.
You're in the near Atlantic in a 10-ton helicopter that's creating an awful lot of rotor wash, is extremely noisy, smelly and vibrates a lot, and yet you get this incredible feeling of it's quite calm and peaceful and eerie, that there are an awful lot of people who've just died here. And it's something that I've never felt before and something that I've never felt since. And I think that was just like us realising that this was going to be a recovery as opposed to a rescue operation.
He had a lot of sadness on his face, and he said there is an accident of 182. So straightway I asked him, is it on the ground or in the air? He said in the air. And I still remember my words. I said, "I'm finished." That was what straightway came out of my mind, or my mouth, and this is how I felt.
stage they told us that the wreckage extended for between 5 and 10 nautical miles in any direction from our position. So we were looking at 100 square miles at least of wreckage. The enormity of this thing was starting to sink in.
Everybody was just hoping for the best at that time. As soon as my dad's friends started coming, relatives started coming, I realized that something was wrong. Nobody actually really told me what happened. I kind of pieced it together.
As far as you could see was wreckage. You could smell the aviation fuel. And for a brief time, the smell of recent death was even stronger than the smell of the aviation fuel.
I was in such complete shock. You know, it just felt like a dream, a nightmare that was passing me. You know, it was something that I kept feeling I'll wake up from.
And it wasn't until the first body came in where the impact hit. It was extensively injured. It was the body of a woman, and she was really badly injured. There was an immediate impact on some of the men in the boat. And some of them were crying and some being sick.
The news was coming when they were already taking out the bodies. I just made a statement. I say, don't worry about that. The plane fell there. I know they know swimming. So no big deal of that. And they will swim.
The winchman came down with this infant in his arms. And it was just terribly wrong that this infant that looked perfect was so cold and so without life. And so out of place. You know, you don't see babies on ships. You don't see babies on the deck of ships in the middle of the Atlantic. And when you do, they're supposed to be warm and alive.
And he said, Ishe, there's been a crash. And that was when I knew they were dead. I knew it. I knew they were dead.
We weren't trying to recover wreckage as such, but there was this container, and I was just amazed to find that there were sweets and a chocolate bar in there with little tooth marks in it. And it's just so demoralising, really. It just wipes you out. You think, you know, there's just no hope. No hope for anybody. We've got this, and yet there's nobody going to be alive, and it's just so tragic.
It was absolutely breathtaking to see such a sad scene, really. But I always remember the sadness I felt in my heart when that boat was coming up the river. And it quite apprehensive of what I may see, and would I be able for this. We laid them on the stretchers, and I called teams, and the nurse and the Garda and the Navy carried each stretcher. You know, it was very blustery that day, actually, because I remember the nurses had to put their hand across the stretcher to make sure that it was steady. And to me, it gave the image, you know, you're all right, you're home, we're caring for you.
It'd been a hard day's work. A tough job that had to be done, but you'd done it. But the impact of it all, the enormity of it, was that night when I saw the news in Dublin. I wept. I went to my cabin and wept.
The Canadian authorities who are investigating the Air India plane crash have been faced today with one central question. Was there a link between that and the bomb which exploded at Narita Airport in Japan at around the same time yesterday morning?
There is still
They can answer
speculation.
that. They'll be on their way.
The flight recorder hasn't been found. The bodies which have been recovered so far have
Suddenly
been
it
injured,
disappeared
but
from
they've
air
shown
traffic
no
control
signs of
radar screens. It is now suspected, though not confirmed, that a bomb blew the plane apart.
Ray has spent a long time and many hard hours trying to advance this investigation. He comes into the office on a day in June 1985, and 331 human beings have been murdered in cold blood. What do you think Ray Cobsey is thinking? But Ray, probably more than anybody, is saying, it didn't have to happen. And that pushes anybody close to the brink of insanity. I'm not saying Ray was insane, but you can just imagine the mindset you'd be in, wondering whether there was something that he could have done or somebody could have done to have prevented this.
Indicated contacts, etc. That would be of value.
There were a lot of people that had met the same fate as my wife. You know, they were the same relatives there. And there they were looking at me and they were saying, the Sikhs did it. And I was one of the person that was wearing a turban. And it was quite a trying moment there. And people saying, you guys did it, you guys did it. And I had to tell them that I lost my wife too. We were the first ones to arrive, and there were no Canadians. And when we went to the Indian consulate people, they said, what citizens you are? We said, we are Canadian citizens. They said, you have to wait for the Canadian people to help you out.
And when we went to Ireland, there was no Canadian representative.
Nothing at all?
No.
And I think that was the beginning of my rage, really. Started in the days after the bombing. I remember then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney sending his condolences to the Indian government, which was such an outrage to me because, you know, my mother was a Canadian citizen. I'm a Canadian born in this country, and yet his condolences are going to India. It's like we were never Canadians in the first place. You know, that this was not something that happened to people that lived in our country.
It was a mammoth undertaking. During the initial stay with the task force in 1985, I wasn't aware that CSIS had information or intelligence concerning the Babar Khalsa's involvement
in the bombings. It was primarily the bomb that went off in Narita, Japan, that provided most of the forensic evidence for the task force to pursue. There were hundreds of police officers working on the case. As a result of the evidence that they uncovered, the RCMP task force in Vancouver were able to determine that the bomb maker was from the Vancouver Island area.
As the investigation unfolded, we found that in a very short time period before the baggage was put on the plane, Inderjeet Rayat went to Auto Marine Electric here in the Lower Mainland and needed to purchase another battery, took some of the components into the store, and sought to use his employee discount at the time he was in the Auto Marine store. When we determined that he purchased a Sanyo tuner, I think that's when it really hit me. Like I had an open mind, yes. Maybe some part of me was saying, oh, could this really be? When I determined that he purchased that Sanyo tuner, I thought, there's too much here now. This is the man in my mind.
They took us right to the hospital in Cork where all the bodies were being brought in. They gave us some forms from Interpol to fill out as best as we could to describe our family members, any noticeable birthmarks or scars, and anything that could help them in the identification process. Because we didn't know at that point what condition the bodies were brought up, because, you know, even in my mind at that time I'm thinking, well, maybe he hit the water, was unconscious, woke up, and he's somewhere, you know, wandering around, doesn't know where he is. Like, I mean, you think, you grasp at all sorts of crazy ideas, thinking that they're still alive.
We were taken to a hospital where they were doing the autopsies and where they were collecting the bodies, and we were all gathered into a room. We were sort of reassured that the deaths were instantaneous and no one was really conscious of what was happening, and that what they were going to do was show pictures of the bodies that they had recovered. They had taken mugshots of all of the people and posted it behind this curtain. I was able to identify my sister. It didn't look like my sister. Her face was flattened and her nose was gone. But I was able to identify her because she had a particular way of wearing her eyeliner. And that eyeliner was still on her face.
There was no external damage. There was nothing kind of, to show from outside, that there was anything violent that had happened to them. It was kind of, as if they're just asleep or something.
And their face was fear. It was just like they had this, something had happened, and they were like this, mortified, and it was like frozen right there. The picture was just full of these. I couldn't have borne to see their bodies. It was just.
Sexy. I wish to ensure that you understand that we do not want to threaten you. We don't want to harm you. We're not going to retaliate against you or your family or anybody else. Okay? Like you related to me before that in India when they take you in for the police station, they beat you up and stuff like that. Well, I want you to understand that we don't do that.
I know that.
Okay, you shouldn't. I don't want you to feel threatened in any way.
You know, I'm just like, you know, I'm really shocked. You know, when you say you're under arrest, like, I'm just really shocked, you know, like, shit.
Like, I was mystified that this man that I thought was a certain type of person was now this type of person. And going through the interrogation, he still remained, this would be hard to explain, he still remained a very nice, cordial, believe it or not, likable person. But at the same time, admitting to you that he did get dynamite, that he did purchase the Sanyo tuner, and...
I don't believe for a second that you're such an awful person, okay? I know you did some bad stuff, and I want you to be honest with me, okay? Now, I know when you're lying to me. You and Mr. Palmer went into the woods. Why don't you tell me what you did when you went into the woods, sir?
We just went on a walk, okay?
Okay, but there was a loud noise. What was that?
Well, what loud noise? What are you
Well, that's what I just
about?
asked you. I didn't want you to repeat the question. I asked you what? What made the loud noise?
What? How can I do it? How do I know?
Okay, that's what I'm asking you. What was the loud noise?
What? I know nothing, you know. I don't know. I don't know.
Listen, man. I want you to be honest with me. Okay? I want you to think about a lot of things, and I want you to be honest.
As nice as they are, as nice as they seem, there's a total lack of emotion when it comes to what's being investigated. The fact that 329 people, 2 others were murdered, the fact that there was little kids, the fact that we produced evidence out of the sea like little Cabbage Patch dolls, clothes off infants and stuff that, as an investigator, just looking at the exhibits almost bring tears to your eyes, have no effect on these terrorist people. Like, have absolutely no effect whatsoever. Just totally numb to it all.
We found out that they loved flowers, the Indian people. I sent word out to the people of Cork, had they flowers. And even little school children came into the front of the hospital with little bouquets of flowers for the children that were victims in that crash.
It's a small village, and when they saw 329 people and families coming there crying, they were deeply moved. They opened their homes and their hearts, and if it was not for them, I don't know. I don't think I would have even made anything of my life.
I keep on looking. Every day was worse than other. Surprisingly, I see my son. He was just sleeping. He looked like a little weaker. That's it. But just a very peacefully sleeping.
Then my husband said, "You're a doctor, you go." I said, "No, you have to come with me." And then I saw the body. Of course, it was nothing like how we sent him. I clung to this body. I started looking at every birthmark he had and was hysterically showing the guard and he said, "Relax, ma'am, this kid will be given to you." So we found Sanjay
But I never found Deepak. And I went looking for every bone that they had there. I now haven't found him. And for a long time I used to think, maybe he's saved. Maybe he'll come one day to Canada and I'll find him. But the scientist in me didn't believe such stupidity.
No, I don't know. That time get happy, get angry, or get sad. Because when you come out, you hear the voice from the people. People were congratulating each other as somebody found the body of their loved ones. That's the first time in my life somebody I have seen, witnessed that.
There was no mystery around the process. There was a policy provision, there was a legal imperative, and there was a manual process that said, after 10 days, get rid of them. So when the RCMP came in after the fact and said, you know, we want access to your intercept material, in most cases all we could show them was our intelligence report that, to the best of our ability, faithfully reflected what was on that tape, now erased. Somebody ought to have had that eureka moment and said, we have to stop doing this. It was a mistake, and it was a mistake that shouldn't have been made. And we have acknowledged that. It shouldn't have happened. There's no joy that comes out of Air India Narita. Not for anybody.
So the next day was, of course, July 1st. They had made arrangements to bring my father to the airport, and I got on the plane, and he was loaded into the cargo. I remember watching him being loaded into the cargo, and I got on the plane, and they're celebrating July 1st, and everybody's happy, and they were having, I remember the menu was lamb with mint jelly. That's what they were having, and I'm thinking, all these happy people, and here I am, this is the first flight, first airplane trip I've ever taken with my father, and I'm up here and he's in the cargo. It's the first father-daughter trip we've ever taken together.
If I lose my husband, am I still a wife? If I lose my children, am I still a mother? Who am I? To walk into that house and know that that bed will never be occupied by that person again. To go to their closets and feel their clothes and smell them. To go through your cookbooks and see that you're going through these recipes that were their favorites. To listen to a song that you knew was one of their favorites. What do you do with all that? You know? It's so full and so empty at the same time.
I know you probably haven't traveled in a while, but don't worry. Expedia Travel Week is coming, and you can save 20% or more on thousands of hotels between June 8th and 12th. Expedia, it matters who you travel with. Limited availability, blackout dates apply.
3,000? We're not getting any oxygen. We have the terrain alarm. Even in our Aero Cruise 603. We are in an emergency.
It must be one of the most amazing flying stories of all time. One that is still hard to believe. An airliner full of passengers out of control at 17,000 feet. And the pilot is stuck outside the plane. In the cockpit, 3 frightened flight attendants are clinging to his legs. If he slips from their grasp, the captain's body could be sucked into the engine and bring down the plane. At the controls, a young co-pilot is battling to get the plane to the nearest airport. The lives of 87 passengers and crew hang by a thread.
A lot of people go through life thinking it'll never happen to me. But you tend to go through life thinking it can.
I said I thought I was going to die, Mother. I thought I was going to die.
This bizarre accident tested the limits of human survival. And the investigation that followed not only exposed the mistakes behind it, but led to new ways of preventing them. For the crew of the British Airways flight from Birmingham, England to Malaga, Spain, the 10th of June began like any other day. Old friends about to do a job they loved.
Yeah, but I'm not doing it.
Stewards Nigel Ogden and Simon Rogers, along with stewardess Sue Prince, had worked together on and off for years. They're an experienced, capable team that takes pride in its work.
At Birmingham, all the cabin crew and all the pilots, they all knew each other. We're all on first-name terms. Simon was a good friend of mine anyway, because we, just go out for a beer or a curry or whatever like that. Everybody was friendly to everybody else.
The one new member of the group was Alistair Atchison, an experienced co-pilot he'd just driven down from Manchester that morning.
Morning, Alistair. Come on in.
Tim Lancaster is captain. He's been a commercial pilot for 21 years.
Well, we've got to get started, eh?
Chief Steward John Heward arrives to give the crew their final briefing.
Morning, everyone. Right. Is that the first officer?
Yeah, just down from Manchester.
Nice seeing your face. Okay. Malaga. Right, looking forward to this. Right, Nige, you can sit up with me up front and talk rugby. Sue, where would you like?
Over the wing.
Okay, so, Simon, you're at the rear. All right, now, just a few safety questions. Nigel.
Before takeoff, the co-pilot performs a walk-around, checking the outside of the aircraft for anything wrong. In the cockpit, Captain Tim Lancaster reviews a log of the maintenance carried out on the plane the day before.
Everything okay?
Fine.
She's just come out of maintenance by the look of it. Hardly much though. Just changed the windscreen.
Many of the passengers know the flight well and are looking forward to a relaxed trip to Spain.
I was going to catch a plane from Birmingham to Malaga to meet my mum. My sister and I were joining her there for a week's holiday, a girls' week.
I live in the south of Spain, and 2 or 3 times a year I come back to see my grandchildren and also my mother. So everyone lives near Birmingham, so that's the route I normally take, Malaga-Birmingham.
These unsuspecting passengers and crew were about to begin an adventure of a lifetime.
Seem to have made yourself comfortable.
Too right.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
My name is Tim Lancaster. Welcome aboard this
British Airways flight to Malaga. Unfortunately,
He seemed laid back and quite jovial, really. You know, sort of a, well, it's a lovely day in Malaga, blue skies, sunshine. Sit back and enjoy the flight.
sunny, and we still expect to get you there on time.
Birmingham Tower, Speedbird 5390. We're ready to start and push.
Speedbird 5390, clear to start and push. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to take you through our safety procedures and equipment. As this information is for your benefit, we ask you to watch and listen carefully. Clear to start engines.
Starting number 2.
Emergency exits are on both sides.
The stewardess shows you the emergency exit and all the emergency gear. And, of course, nobody's really watching. One chap was quite blasé, he was reading the Times, and people weren't really bothering because we've all been on flights and, you know, it's no big deal.
The air can be topped up by using the mouthpiece, and there is a whistle for attracting attention.
The BAC 111 was known as the Jeep of the skies, a workhorse that was easy to maintain and had a good safety record. At 43 tons, this pressurized hull is carrying 81 passengers and 6 crew, and is now climbing to 23,000 feet. In just over 2 hours, they should be in Spain. Only a catastrophic accident could bring this plane out of the skies.
Alistair, I can see my house from here.
2 minutes into the climb, the pilots switch on the autopilot. Tim Lancaster takes off his shoulder straps and relaxes into the flight.
Now I went into the flight deck to ask Tim and Alistair what they would like to drink.
You gentlemen like a tea?
Please, the usual.
Milk, 1 sugar, please.
And I said, your breakfast.